We drive to their house in South Carolina. I'm wearing the uniform that I left Fob Washington, that I was in that like bunker. I'm still wearing the same clothes, and I'm walking into a house in South Carolina. It's just like total mental like insanity. And my dad goes, "Hey, you should surprise your mom." So I'm like, all right. So he's like, "There's a pantry in the kitchen." So I went and I stood in the pantry, and he closes the door. And I kid you not, I will never forget standing in the pantry, looking down at my boots, and all I can see on my boots is the blood from a guy that I had worked on, just all over my boots. And it was like time froze for a minute. I'm standing in a pantry in South Carolina, like, you know, everything's real tight, and I'm looking down at my boots, and I'm just thinking about the blood. And the next thing I know, the door opens, and it's like, surprise.
This episode is brought to you by Trident Coffee, the veteran-owned brand where every sip inspires you to live life full steam ahead. I've been drinking their coffees for a while now, and I'm glad to partner with a company whose products I use. At Trident, they're more than just coffee. They're storytellers. Crafted by veterans, their instant cold brew is perfect for those who serve, those who have served, and anyone who values wellness. Featuring natural ingredients like organic mushrooms, adaptogens, and nootropics, it's more than just a morning pick-me-up. It's your new wellness ritual. Enjoy it at home or on the go, wherever your day takes you. Trident Coffee isn't just about great tasting coffee. It's about empowering you to be the healthiest version of yourself, because great veterans make great citizens. Try their instant cold brew today, along with many other coffee products, and taste the freedom of wellness. Remember, when you choose Trident, you're not just choosing coffee, you're choosing a path of connection through health and wellness. Head on over to tridentcoffee.com and use the promo code TDP15 for 15% off your order. Again, that's TDP15 for 15% off your order. This episode is brought to you by Soflete, a tactical fitness company founded by special operations soldiers. Soflete is dedicated to helping you achieve a healthy lifestyle. From expertly crafted training programs to high-quality proteins, pre-workouts, and sleep and recovery supplements, they've got everything you need to power through your day. Soflete also has a full line of clothing. They have you covered from shorts to cold weather gear. Embracing the motto, Die Living, Soflete inspires us all to embrace life with vigor and resilience. So take the first step towards a healthier you. Visit soflete.com, that's SOFLETE.com, and use the promo code TDP20 to get 20% off your order. Again, that's TDP20 for 20% off your order. Hey everybody, welcome back. My guest this time has already had quite an interesting journey. He enlisted in the Army and served in Iraq as a medic. He came out and did a stint as a military contractor. He has since worked as a police officer both at the local level and at the federal level. He started his own security company, as well as a nonprofit, Defining Truth. But probably one of his biggest challenges was when he realized that he wanted to go into politics. He ran for a Republican congressional seat here in California. He lost, but we get into what he learned about the business of running for political office and everything he learned. He hasn't given up on that dream, but it's definitely, it was an eye-opening experience for him. I know you're going to like this conversation, so let's get into it. Here's episode 152 with Josiah O'Neil. But I would have to imagine, especially trying to balance a first responder career, an active first responder career, and wanting to get into politics, they're never going to mesh, because at the end of the day, even if you try to separate yourself from your organization, you're ultimately going to get connected back to it.
Oh, absolutely. Well, especially as you're familiar coming from the DA's office, right? How political things really are at the top. So, you know, they like to keep everyone below them, like non-political, don't say anything. But the truth is, especially with counties and sheriff's departments, they're elected officials. So there's a lot of politics, you know, there's a lot of drama behind the scene as to who's getting those positions. And I think that the big motivation for me was, you know, if you take my original, you know, I went into the Army when I was 17, and then all those other things I did, about 20 years of public service in general, if you combine all the places I was at. And I was just sick of sort of being the door kicker as I got older and realizing that the bureaucrats were making decisions. And that's where my focus started to really shift. especially getting through the Michael Brown years of hands up, don't shoot. And then there was a lull, right? And then politics is on the rise, and all of a sudden everybody hates cops again. And then you have the BLM years. And one of my first, sort of big deals after I left the feds and came back to local, with SO, was all the riots. So we deployed with a bunch of guys down to La Mesa when they had the riots down there. It was just insane. And I think having worked at the 50,000 foot level back in DC and getting involved in all that stuff, I started to see this huge disconnect between the reality on the ground and what these talking heads were saying in the news. And there's a lot of lying there, right? And my frustration was, why don't we have anybody speaking up for us? Like, where's our leadership? Where's the sheriffs? You got your Chad Biancos. He's a rare gem in the world of, leadership. And that was taxing, right? Which I'm sure you've known talking to guys. Guys are going to Idaho, Florida. People are fleeing like crazy. Primarily, I think, because of that. We would watch these people lie about us on TV or the news, and then have to go out and deal with riots and people spitting in your face and crime skyrocketing. Even look at the COVID years, where we couldn't book people in jail, and you have guys repeatedly committing felonies, right? I had one particular guy I talked about a lot when I ran, was he did a couple occupied 459, so he was doing home invasions, burglaries. He did 2 or 3. They would not remand him to custody because of COVID, right? And then finally, he stabbed somebody in the face. And then all of a sudden, it was like, we got to remand this guy to custody. So that was just a lot of pent up frustration over the years. And I could go on into the same thing at the geopolitical level, being involved overseas in counterterrorism. So I'm watching all this stuff, and I kind of wanted to take the position of us that had been there, the sort of boots on the ground, and I wanted to put that forward into the political realm and say, hey, like, instead of just another law school grad who never did anything in his life and he's running because he's got friends who can give him a lot of money. What if we had public servants running? It's not unique. You see this all across the country, right? You get a lot of former vets, former public servants, law enforcement guys that are starting to run. So that's kind of what primed me into it. But
well, you've definitely got a lot of pieces to your puzzle. So let's start back at the beginning. Mm-hmm. Where's hometown? Where'd you grow up?
So actually, I grew up in Mexico, which throws people off. My parents were missionaries with non-denominational with Calvary Chapel. They left back in the early 80s, moved to Mexico. About halfway through our time there, they switched and went to Ecuador in South America. So I grew up going to school there. I went to Mexican schools. My first language was Spanish. I learned English at home. When I graduated, we were in Ecuador when I graduated. That was the first time that I permanently moved back.
Graduated high school?
Yeah.
So what age were you when you went down to Mexico?
When they first moved, I was 3 months old. So I have no recollection of I was born in Reno, Nevada. I know that.
So your whole childhood growing up was Mexico and Ecuador.
Yeah. Yeah.
What brought you back to the States after high school?
I first came back to go to college, and I came to Marietta. And but I think first semester, maybe right into second semester, we invaded Iraq. And I had always intended to join the Army. Both my grandparents served, my dad had served. I knew I wanted to do that. And so that was kind of a no-brainer. A lot of guys my age at that time, as soon as that kicked off, GWAT was on the ramp, went off and joined. So
you graduated high school in 90, 91?
No, I graduated in 2000.
Oh, you said Iraq. I was thinking the first Gulf Wars.
Yeah, 2003, the invasion. So I graduated early though. So because I was in South America, I was doing a combination. I went to a bilingual collegiate school there at the very end in Spanish, and then I was coming home and doing double my work in English, and I was able to speed that up. So I graduated when I was 15. Then I hung out for a little bit, got a job, saved up to go to college, and then I ended up coming here, like I was saying, doing about a year. So when I joined the Army, I was 17, and I had to have you can get permission slips signed by your parents. They were still in Ecuador. So I actually faxed them a piece of paper from the recruiting office in Murrieta saying, I want to go.
What was the connection for you to come to Murrieta?
At the time, it's no longer there. There was a Bible college, the one off Hot Springs, that was still, in its heyday, full of students. It was running, and that was Calvary Chapel. So we started there. I actually met my wife there, but she didn't like me at the time. So we parted for about 7 years and then reconnected later. But that's where I met her. But that was my connection. So other than that, I didn't know anybody here. I didn't have anybody. We had some friends that lived in Yuma, Arizona, actually. When I first came to the States, before school started, they're the ones that kind of received me. And I worked for his pest and termite control business all summer, saving money to pay for that first semester. But I didn't finish because the Iraq invasion kicked off. And I was 2 semesters in, didn't have any money, and I joined the Army.
My question, first off, is you mentioned that you knew you were going to serve.
Yeah.
How did that correlate, though, to going to college? What was your plan at that point? Had the Iraq invasion not occurred and you'd have finished college, how was that going to play into serving in the military? What was your plan?
I probably I obviously would have gone there, but it just would have been slower. I wasn't in a hurry. There was nothing happening. I had actually, it's funny how the psyche of a young man, probably 14 is when I started looking at Army recruiting sites. So I knew that that is something that I wanted to do. So it was coming. There wasn't any hurry. I was considering what I should do, where I should go. The war just expedited everything because, as you know, there was a surge, and especially, at that time, they were just like, let's get people in here, right? So I'm sure it was a great day for the recruiter because there was no recruiting. I went in and was like, I'm ready to go,
Now, why the Army over the other branches?
That's a funny story, and I'll tell you for all my Marines friends out there. At that time, there was a recruiting station here in Murrieta that had, all the services were in the same area. So it was literally a hallway, and there was a door that said Army, and then the next door down was the Marines. I walked down to the Marines at first, and I was looking for what can I do here? What options do I have? I wanted to get something beneficial and, good for my life. The Marine Corps' offer to me was, we have really good looking uniforms. That was it. That's what the guy said. Now, look, I'm not saying that's all the Marines have to offer, but at the time I kind of waited for something more, and he just looked at me. He's like, look at these pants. I was like, okay. And then I came back and I was like, hold on. And I go down and I check the Army, and they're like, we have 225 jobs you can have, and, all these, programs or whatever. Mainly I was interested in medicine, and they offered me that combat medic contract. And that's what I wanted to do. And the Marines obviously have the corpsmen, so that would have been a Navy route. I did not want to join the Navy. So I went with the Army.
What year did you enlist?
2003.
And you were still 17 at the time, though, correct?
Yes.
When did you end up at basic training?
July. So I turned 18, in August, so it wasn't that far. So I probably started talking to them in 2002. That's probably when I went in to talk. No, it had to be 2003 because the invasion. So it was a very short time period. It was a matter of months between whenever we were watching Shock and Awe on the news. I went in, talked with them, but my entry date is July 2003. So somewhere in a 3-month period, I said I want to go. I went to MEPS and I was gone.
What was your parents' take on it? Were they supportive? Were they concerned, obviously, as parents?
It's their fault because they had raised us very independent and adventurous, I think. I had grown up, obviously, we grew up in foreign countries, but even from a young age, they had encouraged us to go out and do things. I think my first international trip alone, I was 10. I went with a teen mission organization out of Florida. I went to Scotland, 3 months away. Then I came back. The next year I went to Yucatan. We built a school. So it was like a construction mission trip. Excuse me. So I think it was sort of a natural course. I mean, by the time we were up and out, I mean, I had already moved here to go to school, so I was already very independent. I do recall talking on the phone with my dad, and he said something to the effect of, "Do they have a shorter contract?" And I was like, "No, it's 4 years. You know, that's what it is to be a medic." And he goes, "All right, well, it's your decision." So I'm sure there was some hesitation, but not really for service, more of like probably fear of the war and all of that going on.
You mentioned that your dad had served?
He did. Yeah.
When did he serve?
During the Vietnam years. And he was they didn't have the same code or title for medics at the time. He was a behavioral health specialist. So he was working with guys, you know, coming back out of Vietnam. And he was over in Germany most of the time. That's where his base was there. So
I guess where I'm going with this, was there, as you were growing up, was there a strong push or a strong drive towards patriotism and serving as far as the military goes?
Yeah, I think, well, definitely. My parents did a great job, no matter where we were, at sort of keeping us tethered to where we came from. So, you know, they were missionaries, so obviously they felt called to go and help people in third world countries. And they did. But at home, there was always a sense of, you know, patriotism and service. It was a long legacy because, you know, both of my grandparents and my great grandparents, it just, you follow down the line, everyone had served somehow. And we grew up with that. And I think the culture in the home was important too, right? So as a young boy, my brother, I have a brother and 3 sisters. My brother and I definitely grew up watching John Wayne and you know, all the old, you know, Fighting Seabees and D-Day and all these films that had a sense of patriotism and remember who you are and sort of define manhood. I think my parents did a good job at balancing that. It wasn't like crazy, you know, to an extreme. As Christians also, that kept us balanced because there was a center of how we are to conduct ourselves. But oddly enough, right, those two are very closely aligned because the Christian Judaic values are what define Western civilization. So you have a very close connection between the biblical view on what a man is and what you are to do for your country and your family and your service. So those two are very close, which is kind of what we do now with Defining Truth.
You mentioned watching movies as a kid growing up in Mexico and in Ecuador. Are you having to rent these movies or are American old war movies on TV?
No. So back in the day, it was, you know, we would receive a lot of care packages from people, and or when we would maybe come home to visit family, we would record everything on a VHS, right? So you'd have like a tape with 6 movies on it. It'd be like War Wagon, you know, Fort Apache or whatever. And yeah, so you'd have to fast forward, you know, to what movie you want to watch. And that was across the board. You know, it was Red Skeleton and I Love Lucy and all these classics. You know, it's interesting you mentioned that because we were sort of in this time capsule because my parents left the U.S. in 1985. And then from there, you're out of, you know, the advancement or the progress of culture in the U.S. So our upbringing was very much, I think, how they knew an upbringing. It's really a lot of 50s and 60s, right? It was those were the shows and the movies we watched. Yeah, I mean, I watched Spanish television too, like Chapulín Colorado. For anybody watching in Spanish, they'll know what that is. Dennis the Menace in Spanish, you know. So whatever was on TV would have been dubbed in Spanish, but right. all the old school stuff was recorded or sent to us.
You mentioned you're one of 5. Mm-hmm. Were you a good kid? And where I'm kind of going with this is for those who, we always say, for the kids who grew up in the United States, they don't really appreciate what they have here because they don't see what others don't have. But when you're in Mexico and you're in Ecuador, are you able to kind of be a little bit of a rebel, or were you kind of a good kid who just clung to home?
No, I wouldn't put good kid over the title of my head in a picture. I was hyper. I was a really active little boy. But I wasn't a bad kid in as much as like I never got any legal trouble. I never got into drugs or anything. But I was rambunctious. That being said, I think earlier than later, what you mentioned right now, sort of that understanding of like where you are versus the privilege that first world countries have, that definitely set in, because even coming to visit the United States in my perspective was like coming to the land of golden streets. I mean, it smelled different. It looked different. The institutions are different, right? You call the police, someone comes. We didn't really call the police in Ecuador, or Mexico for that matter. So I think very early on, I had a deep appreciation for what America was, because I was able to see with my very own eyes the results of what now as an adult we describe as culture war and political movements, right? I may not have known how to articulate it as a teenager, but now I understand that all of these things that we battle over in the culture war and in politics, they lead to these results. So oddly enough, Ecuador, right, for example, very far left. They have, they elected a communist president. Heroes there, when I was growing up in school, their heroes were Che Guevara and Castro in Cuba. So with my own eyes, separate from propaganda or, the American left and academics, I was able to see the results of all of this banter and really developed a deep appreciation for the United States, and sort of what we were tethered to culture-wise. So,
did you find it for you growing up? Were you accepted, or did you kind of always feel like the outsider? Did it never really kind of even come to your radar?
I don't think it ever even was a consideration. I think that this sort of, the victim culture in the U.S. is very unique to like Western first world countries. In third world countries in general, people don't whine as much about stuff like that. It's like, you're different. Well, who cares? All the obsession with race and identity and all of that is very much an American thing. Well, you see it in Europe as well, but it just wasn't really a thing growing up. I mean, I knew I was different, obviously. You should see pictures of me in school, like in third grade. It's like a sea of brown and there's one white towhead. I had really like almost white blonde hair at the time. But I didn't know any different. My best friends were all, there in Mexico. And no, I really enjoyed it, actually.
Did you ever get deeply involved in sports?
Played soccer a lot. Yeah. I think my dad, in his desire to, have a son that played like baseball. I did I think a month of football when I was in Mexico. And I'm smaller as it is. Growing up, I was
American style football?
Yeah, American style football. I was on a peewee team. That didn't work. It didn't work. I went back to soccer. And then, of course, Ecuador played soccer as well. So that was huge. But always did something, though.
And did you know that you wanted to come back to the States early on? Because I'd almost kind of wonder if, though there was the draw to the States, you came back and you visited and you saw what we have to offer here, but could there be for a 17-year-old almost a sense of, I feel more comfortable staying in where I've grown up?
I think it was probably simpler in a teenager's mind of just like, this was a fun place, that was home. I enjoyed growing up in other countries, but it's tough, you don't have the quality of life or amenities that Americans enjoy. And I was aware of that. I was well aware as we got older that, our Christmas time rolled around. A lot of it was from boxes that churches would donate to our family. And I didn't have a problem with that. Nobody cared. But there was definitely, it was a very sort of, not to simplify it, but it was just kind of like, America's a really nice place, and I'd like to go there when I get older. Plus, there was opportunities like going to school, and I knew I would end up there.
So 18 years old, you're in the Army. Where'd you go to basic training?
Fort Benning,
and
Georgia.
what was that experience like for you, going from being a kid, growing up, in Central and South America, and now the rules and regulations of the Army?
I think it was probably the best thing I ever did. I think for a lot of young men, the military or some sort of public service that gives you that discipline, they should do it, right? I'm all about everybody doing it if you have the opportunity to. I enjoyed it. I have an interesting story about boot camp, though. I wasn't able to finish the first time because they put me on. Okay, so Fort Benning at that time, it's all males, right? It's home of the infantry. It was kind of odd as a medic that I went there. A lot of medics were going to Fort Jackson or other sort of non-combat arms schools, but whatever the Army was doing, I don't know. I went to Fort Benning. So my group of guys at boot camp was kind of split all over the place as far as MOSs and occupations. So towards the end, right before the end of boot camp, the first time I went, I got really bad shin splints, and I went into medical and they took x-rays, and basically I had like stress fractures. I had lines going up and down my shins, and they sent me on 30 days convalescent, which of course I didn't have family. Or my immediate family was out of country. So I went to stay with some cousins of mine in Washington State for 30 days. It was very odd. And then the Army's like, okay, you're back. So I get back, and I'm just like wrecked mentally because I was so close to finishing that first time. Where we have at the very end at that time was called FTX. It's the final training exercise. I get back, and there's, my class originally had graduated, so they're gone. I come back to this empty sort of company training area. I go in to see the captain, I believe, at the time, and he kind of is like, you can just get out right now if you want. He's like, you're not really in. It wouldn't be a dishonorable discharge. And he was sort of offering me like, you can just go home and like this, like it never happened, right? Which, psychologically, you have to understand at the time when you're going through boot camp, you're like, that's kind of tempting, And I remember going to.
Are you facing the idea, or you're going to be starting back at zero again?
Well, so that's what he eventually told me. I didn't understand that. I thought I could jump back in, and he's like, you have to start day one with another class. Now they did keep record. There's sort of a go, no go checklist at that time as you progress through training, but yeah, basically I had to start at week 1. And so I went over to a payphone, right? I didn't have a cell phone, and I dialed international to get a hold of my dad. I told him what happened, and I just wanted to run it by him and say, what do you think about this? And he did the same thing. He said, it's your decision or whatever, but he did say, he goes, I will tell you this. He goes, I think you should finish what you start. And he goes, I think you'll regret not finishing something that you started. And that was enough for me. So I hung up. I went back in. I'm like, sir, I want to start over. So I restarted boot camp, this time closer to the fall. And it was freezing cold, by the way, if you're out in the middle of nowhere in November. And they allowed me to, navigate. I didn't have to repass, but when I had to go through all the events together with this new class. And then by the time I got to, the jump off point, I just re-engaged, and I ended up doing the final training exercise. Right at the end of that, we have this thing called the CTA, the company training area. Command came out and had all of us come out onto this area. It was off hours. It was kind of strange. We were near the end of boot camp, and we all lined up in formation. We're all standing there at attention, and the captain comes out and says, look, everyone who had orders, because we had all signed contracts. The Army lets you sign, like, you want to go to Louisiana, you want to go to this place or whatever. I say Louisiana because my original contract was to go to a armored cav unit. And he comes out and he says, look, everybody that had orders to wherever you were, Hawaii, all these places, you're all canceled. You're going to 3rd Infantry Division. And it was like, no questions asked. And obviously during war, they had the authority to do this. We didn't know, we were excited. We had no idea what war was or anything. So he says, all your contracts are canceled. We had guys going to Korea, they were all excited, and they're like, no, you're going to Fort Stewart, Georgia, which is home of 3rd Infantry Division, 3rd ID. And basically he said for subsequent deployment to Iraq, like, if you remember, everybody thought, oh, the war's over because we beat the Republican Guard. But quickly you had all the international forces, you had Al-Qaeda and all these foreign fighters that started pilfering into Iraq. And then things really started to ramp up, right? So it wasn't until mid-2004 that you started seeing these first new things called IEDs. That was new, platter charges, and then eventually they would become EFPs, explosively formed penetrators. That was all new. So we were coming in, soft skin Humvees, no armor. We didn't know what was going on. And units that were there were kind of like, yeah, it wasn't too bad. 3rd ID had been there during the invasion, and they had no casualties other than some friendly fire casualties where an F-16 dropped a bomb on some guys. So that was kind of shocking. I didn't care because I had no idea. I just wanted to join the Army. Some guys were pretty upset. So within a year, though, just to skip forward a little bit, within a year, 14 guys from that class were dead from a mix of IEDs, snipers early on at the time. So we had quite the adventure we were going into, but we had no idea at the time.
And you remained a medic, though?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, they definitely needed medics. Yeah.
What was that like for you, as a young man, your first experience like with a mass casualty event?
Well, I think you prep as much as you can. I remember during training, they would show us a lot. Remember that scene in Black Hawk Down where he's got the femoral artery bleed? We watched that I don't know how many times. I went to the after boot camp. We went to Fort Sam Houston for the Army Medical Science Academy. We go to combat medic school. You got a lot of good guys there instructing. One of the guys there was a former Special Forces 18 Delta guy that had gone green to gold, become an officer, and now he was a PA. I remember really, really benefiting from his instruction. But I mean, it's like any training. Like you can fill your brain as much as possible, but until reality sets in, you don't really know what it's like. I will say they did a good job at preparing us. I felt we didn't see. I don't think reality hit us until about 3 months in. So we were still driving over the berm at that time. I went as part of an Advon advance party with command in November of 2004. We landed in Kuwait and we drove into Iraq in a long convoy. We saw some casualties, not from my unit, so it was still very distant from me. But we on the way up, we'd saw like trucks, like HEMTs that had been hit by IEDs or whatever. At the time, I don't even think we knew what an IED was. I just saw a burning truck. No idea how it happened. So it's all kind of all fun and games, right? It's like a movie for the first about 3 months. And then we had our first set of casualties. So we lost 3 guys in an attack. And it was like, it rocked your world. It was an EFP that was under, I believe under a bridge or near a bridge, almost back onto base. And, for anyone listening, EFPs, these things that they were using was actually something that we came up with back in the 40s, right? They were designed to penetrate the hulls of ships. So it's a concave, charge that has a chemical reaction and it pierces through armor very effectively. So if you can imagine about the size of a coffee can, they vary, but that was very common. And there's certain components. The back is drilled, so there's a lathe, and they put a breech cap on the back, and then the front has to be pressed with a I think a 2-ton press, if I'm not mistaken, to press a copper or steel plate. Copper ended up being very popular, and that plate is reversed. So imagine a V, and as it explodes, that plate closes forward into a point, kind of like a sabot round, and that's what pierces through. And then that hot metal, as it gets through the armor, disperses into, thousands of fragments and whatever else it hits. And all that bounces around inside and, tears you up. So we didn't know any of this. We started getting armored Humvees around that time. And we didn't understand, like, why are we getting armor? We said we had sandbags on the floors, and people were welding. We had mechanics welding like steel plates to the sides of the doors. But this first one just decimated the vehicle. It Wallace, Fisher, and Dreyer were their names. You had a gunner, you have a TC driving, a guy driving in a TC in the front passenger seat, and we actually had a ride along from the country of Georgia, a Georgian soldier who was in the back rear seat. He got blown out the side like 20 feet, lost his legs, but survived. All of our guys died. And I think that next day was like, okay, this is real, right? This is not a movie. It's not fun. I remember as a medic, we part of our job was we're always taking care of the guys, right? Doc's always there, whether it's mental health or meds or whatever. We recovered that vehicle and cleaned it out. So, we had to cut their bodies out with trauma shears, and just it's these extreme traumatic events, like you said, right? For a young guy, a teenager, just overwhelming your brain. I forget who it was. I think there's a French author, and he was writing in reference to World War I, but he said, war is the only place where a young man will experience every emotion in life in the period of 1 year, right? Death, happiness, loss, grief, etc. And that was the beginning, really. Our unit went on to have the second highest casualty rate in the division. So there was an infantry unit that was a little bit higher than us, but it was rough.
Looking back on it now, and you've got 20 years of the more talk about mental health, the more talk about the impacts of combat and experience. For you, looking back on it, though, what you just said something that really resonates and stuck with me is that as a medic, your job was not only there to put the Band-Aid on, your job was also to address the mental health issues. And so you're taking care of everybody else. Who was taking care of you guys?
Yeah, nobody. And I think that was something that we struggled with. A lot of people did. I digress a little bit. When I say nobody, I think that is highly dependent on who you're working for. So I had some great people that I served under, and some not so great people. But it is true that, I think in law enforcement, you see something similar. It's like, well, who responds to the responders, right? At that time, PTSD wasn't even a thing. I'd never even heard of that when we were there. Most of our leadership, even at the highest level, you're talking your E9s, your sergeant majors, et cetera, had never been to combat before. Some of them, if they were lucky, deployed during Desert Storm, right? But then again, it was
Coffee didn't even get cold.
Where were you at Desert Storm? Some guys got into stuff, some didn't. I know in our unit particularly, we didn't have a whole lot of experience. I had an awesome commander. His name was Pennell, Lieutenant Colonel Pennell. At the time, he was a lieutenant colonel. Was just, in my estimation, a phenomenal leader. And then we had a bunch of, non-commissioned officers who this was kind of new for them, So we were all learning as we went. And that part that you mentioned about sort of being the all to go to, I don't think understand that at first. Even in Kuwait, before we drove over, we were prepping. It's all trauma. But then we got there and we realized a lot of it would be like cleaning blood out of the seat where this guy's buddy just died, or it would be talking with someone or driving them down to the mental health, at the cache, or that we didn't understand because we'd never done that before. You'd never been in combat, and a lot of our leadership had never been in combat. And we didn't know what the escalation would be. Muqtada al-Sadr in Sadr City had 200,000+ fighters, in a neighborhood in Baghdad. I didn't hear about that guy until we were there. Now, part of that is my position, obviously. I wasn't an intel guy. I wasn't in command, so maybe there was more intel high above. But in our role at that sort of troop level at the bottom, you found out what you did each day when you woke up in the morning. And it evolved very quickly, though, very quickly. After that first attack, it didn't stop there. It continued. So we kind of quickly realized, okay, here's how this is going to go, right? There's only a couple medics. There's more guys and units going out every day on patrol and missions than there are medics. So the way it worked is the evening before, during platoon briefing, the command would decide, okay, what mission is in most need of a medic? So that's kind of how we were doled out, right? If you're going on a really dangerous place, well, you definitely need a medic, right? So that's how we were sort of assigned every day. So we quickly realized, okay, we are probably going to see something on a routine basis here. You did and you didn't, depending on the day. But then we realized, okay, so we're going to have casualties. There's KIA where someone dies, and then there's WIA or wounded in action where you that's a whole nother level of trauma when you're missing your fingers or your arm, or you're so incapacitated that you have to go home now and you don't get to finish the year. So we caught on quick, as far as what that would entail. And I don't think anything could prepare you for that. Probably now more than then, right? 20 plus years into GWAT, the Global War on Terror, guys in my generation are all leading stuff now. So I think there's a lot to pass down and prep people. But I mean, even the way we looked and dressed is completely different, to what we're doing now. You look at guys now, they all look like unconventional operators. Their uniforms look more like, how unconventional guys did prior to that. And it's all changed because we adapted. So psychologically, I think the same adaptation occurred.
How long was that first deployment?
The unit deployed for 14 months, I think. I came home. Remember, I went on an advon. So I came home in November of 2005. So I was there November to November, so 12 months plus, give or take a couple weeks. It was long.
Coming back home after that first deployment, how was your headspace? Were you still in it? Did it? And I ask this rhetorically, but did it change you?
Oh, 100%. So I'll never forget when I was told basically in November, towards the end of November, I know this because the day I got home, the next day was Thanksgiving. That's how I always remember that anchor. So I was told hey, Doc, you were on the Advon party, so you're going to get to leave in November. And the day after I left, one of my buddies, a medic, was killed on a mission. So that was, messing with you mentally as well. Plus everyone else that we had lost. But again, nobody talked about PTSD. There was no transition. Here's my transition. I was on there was a forward operating base, an LZ for helos called Washington. It was in the green zone there in Baghdad. LZ Washington was a jump off point where we would come in and out of the Baghdad area. Now that's in downtown Baghdad. So you had to go from Washington to what we called BIOP at the time, Baghdad International Airport. And from there you could get on a fixed wing and leave the country. Here's my transition to give you an idea. There was incoming mortars when we were at FOB Washington, when we were trying to leave and get on the CH-47, the Chinook. So we're in a bunker and we hear, the duck and cover go off. There's mortars. You can hear them popping out on a distance. And there was this big freeze moment where the LT is trying to decide, are we going to get on the helicopter or are we going to hide? And we were like, let's go. I don't care. Let's get out of here. So I remember running across, this is at night, we ran across the tarmac, you have the rotors spinning, your little LED lights. I get on the back. I was near the back where the tail's down next to the gunner. And as we take off, we're popping flares because that was just standard, right? Combat takeoff. And we got out of there to the sound of mortars hitting the ground and flares popping. We land at BIOP. We get on a plane. We flew. I don't remember if we stopped in Kuwait or not. I have no recollection of that, but I know that there wasn't any transition point. I think we did stop in Kuwait. Anyways, we get back within a day or two. We land back in the States. I walk off onto this parade field, and my dad, I think, picks me up, and we drive straight back to their house. At the time, they had moved back to the States. They're living in South Carolina. We drive to their house in South Carolina. I'm wearing the uniform that I left FOB Washington, that I was in that bunker. I'm still wearing the same clothes, and I'm walking into a house in South Carolina. It's just total mental insanity. And my dad goes, hey, you should surprise your mom. So I'm like, all right. So he's like, there's a pantry in the kitchen. So I went and I stood in the pantry, and he closes the door. And I kid you not, I will never forget standing in the pantry, looking down at my boots, and all I can see on my boots is the blood from a guy that I had worked on, just all over my boots. And it was time froze for a minute. I'm standing in a pantry in South Carolina, everything's real tight, and I'm looking down at my boots, and I'm just thinking about the blood. And the next thing I know, the door opens, and it's surprise, and I go out and I hug my mom. That was my transition. And that's not healthy, by the way. Yeah, there was no transition for anybody at the time.
For you, you had a 4-year enlistment.
Mm-hmm.
Was there ever any plan when you first joined to make it longer than that, or were you one and done in your mind?
I don't think I knew going in. I think, I've talked about this a lot with guys that stayed in. My little brother ended up joining, went to Ranger Battalion, and then another unit and stayed there for a while. I think that greatly depended on your experience with the unit that you were with. And I don't mean the combat, I mean the leadership. And that was a big lesson for me because, the esprit de corps and the morale is massive and you want to talk about organizational leadership. You take care of your people and treat them well, you will go way farther. I did not like where I was at. I didn't like, even now looking back, I can honestly say, that completely changed my opinion. I got out because I didn't like the leadership at the time. And I was like, I'm done. I'm out of here. In fact, most of us, all but two, I think, of the medics all got out immediately. And that would have been different had we had different leadership.
Did SF or going Ranger, that option ever kind of...
Oh, yeah, I thought about it. We all thought about it because we would run into those guys or we'd see those guys, and, you're like, man, that's cool. And, but I think that headspace wise, that is so dependent on your experience, I mean, obviously later I can look back and say, God knew, but the truth is I think at that point I needed to get out. Like that was a healthy move for me. Yeah, I definitely thought about it. I had friends that went. There was a guy deployed with me that year who came back and went through selections. Went to I think 3rd group. Good dude. He's out now. But that trauma just compounded. He just went back over and over and over again. And I'm sure we'll get into it. But I did end up going back multiple times, just not active duty. But at the time, I was done.
So for that transition, that first transition, what year did you get out?
I got out in 2007. That was my contract, 03 to 07.
You mentioned going to work for Blackwater. Was that already on your horizon, or what were you thinking you were going to be doing after you got out?
So my intro to private military contracting occurred when we were there. So about halfway through my time, that year, just for listeners, was the first Iraqi national elections. So there was a lot of political stuff going on, and there was a lot of activity from opposition trying to stop us from doing that. Also, that was the year of Saddam's trial. So both of which my unit was involved with. We monitored election sites and did missions to counteract, opposition during the election. And we also pulled security for Saddam's trial because the trial actually happened on the base that we were at, which at the time was, very hush-hush and secretive. But because of that, during that time, an individual was flown into our FOB who was a PA, who had come from Special Forces. He did, I think, 13 years with the teams, and then also did the PA program, and then went back and did support with CAG, and then eventually was assigned over to our unit. You want to talk about phenomenal leadership. On the opposite of what I just said, he became quite the mentor and example of, in my mind, what a leader should be. Immediately, it probably had to do with where he came from, right? But his concern and treatment of us led almost immediately to, he could have asked us to storm the gates of hell and we would have done it. So, in fact, it's worth saying, one of the very first things this guy did, he came in as a captain at the time. One of the very first things he did was he walks into our aid station where all the combat medics, we were down kind of during the day. And he goes, "Hey, I'm going to get coffee. Does anybody want coffee?" That just blew my mind. For anyone who's been in the military, we don't fraternize a lot with officers. And if you did, it wasn't like, you're going to get me a coffee. That just didn't happen. And we assumed, I didn't know if he meant like, do you want me to get you a coffee or what? He's, and his hat's kind of cocked back on his head. He was kind of relaxed. And he's like, no, I'm going to the chow hall. I'll get it. He came back with coffees for everyone that asked for one. And just that simple act set a tone that I had never seen before, even there, 6 months into that deployment. I'll get to why this connects to PMC. So given his background, he had friends who were at the time working as contractors with Triple Canopy and Blackwater at the time, who had the diplomatic contract there. During those years, most contractors used third country nationals to do static security. So like when Blackwater had a base, there would be guard towers and sort of static security that was run usually by Colombians or Peruvians. So remember, I grew up in South America. So one day this captain comes in and he says, hey, some of my buddies are over, doing contracting stuff. They need some help running sick call because they don't speak Spanish. And it was like some 18 Delta from the SEAL teams that was doing medic, whatever, but he didn't speak Spanish. So the captain was like, how'd you like to, change out of uniform? We're going to get in a Chevy Love. It's a truck that's really popular over there. And we're going to drive over to the base.
I'm old enough to remember Chevy Loves.
And he's like, we're going to drive over.
One.
Yeah, seriously. So, this just like blows my mind. It's because I'm not in anything special. I've never been in an unconventional unit, nothing. So I'm used to like you iron your pants and you clean your boots, every day. And here's this captain, he's got his long tab, says special forces. And he's like, do you want to go off base, in civilian clothes? And I'm like, absolutely, I do. So takes me over there and we run sick call for I think we went to Triple Canopy that time. It was Peruvians. And so, we helped them out with their questions. They had some injuries from guys getting hit in the towers. And then some of it was just basic medical. Like one guy had a compartment syndrome in his calf from running. And I just did basic translation. Plus I was a medic. So I'm sure, I don't even remember who it was, but whoever the contract medic was, I'm sure appreciated it because I kind of just took over and ran sick call in the morning. And so I started doing that once a week. And I was able to meet some guys all because of the captain. I didn't know them. But it was really good for, I think, career development, for learning for me. And then long story short, when I got out almost right away, I got a call from somebody saying, hey, Blackwater's looking for medics. And mostly at that time, they wanted guys with more specialized backgrounds, right? They wanted Rangers, SF guys, things like that. And I was like, well, I don't qualify for that, but there were exceptions for medics and for canine handlers. So, I reached out to this captain and he's like, oh, I got you. And he gets me this recommendation letter from the regional, I forget his title. It was like the regional director or something of Triple Canopy, which is one of the big, military contractors. And he gives me this write-up about, how I helped support them and how grateful they were. It was super cool, little attaboy, right? So I submit that, I get my background and I submit it all. And they picked me up right away. That moved pretty quick. So I ended up getting a call from them saying, get your TS and your background going in the Q system. And then I got a date at the time, Prince still owned the company. Moyoc Moyoc was their, private military base where we all went to train. And they did like this sort of in-doc. It wasn't really an in-doc, but they weeded people out. So it was like a 30-day thing that we went to. We started with like 42 people, and I think my class graduated with 12. So a lot of that was peer evals, but it was like basic weapon stuff and handling. We did room clearing, we did convoy training. We started right. That whole mission was all high threat protection. So I started going into a whole other world of learning, that kind of stuff, and TAC medicine and all that. So, man, went through that fast, graduated. And they're like, okay, go home and we'll let you know. We'll send you a plane ticket. It'll be soon. And I think I came back for a couple weeks and then I get these Pelican cases delivered in the mail. And it's just full of gear, right? It's got like 511 stuff. It's got binos. And I'm just like, this is, in my mind, I was like, this is so cool, And then they sent a plane ticket and I started going overseas, went back to Iraq. I was in Hilla, about 90 miles south of Baghdad at what we called a RIO, regional embassy office. My med stuff expired when I was there, and I actually changed over in the like job title just to being just a shooter, like a protective specialist, PSS guy. And that's how I ended up going back sort of over and over again. At the time, I think I was on 3090s. So I did 3 months on, 1 month off. And a couple times I extended it to make a little more money and then take time off when I came home. So I left, the last time I left in 2009, close to 2010. So that was fun.
What brought that to an end for you?
I got married. Yeah. So remember I had told you that Lindsay didn't like me. Lindsay's my wife. She didn't like me when we met originally. All this time had passed and we had reconnected after. So very, very quickly, I had told her that I was interested in marriage. I didn't want to play around or date, and she agreed. And I ended up proposing. I flew out to California because I was living in Denver at the time. I flew out to California to meet her and her parents. And before we got married is when Blackwater, responded, and I went out to train and everything. So those pelicans I actually sent to her parents' house because I didn't have a home. And my parents were in, the Carolinas still. So I think about halfway through, if I'm correct, that contract, I flew home and we got married. So I was in Iraq during all the planning. I have no idea. She did all of that.
Just tell me where to show up.
Yeah. Flew home, got married, went on a honeymoon, and then I went back to Iraq. And then quickly I realized, all right, this isn't going to work here being married, right? Like you literally spend your life overseas. So it was good for where it was, what it was. But I knew I was done after that time in 2009. So I came back and moved back to the States permanently. And then I was really, needing to reinvent myself because I didn't know what to do, right? Blackwater had taken me right off of the military. In between Blackwater and the Army, I worked with AMR for a little bit because I was a medic, but that was for a matter of like 7 to 8 months. So now that I was home permanently, I had no idea what I was going to do. And that began a whole nother adventure.
Was it immediately law enforcement, or had you considered the fire EMS route first?
I looked at fire shortly, but it was so difficult to get hired with anyone. It just wasn't even like plausible, like the time frame. And I immediately, what I did actually in the short term is I went to work for Home Depot. We had a friend who was like a regional guy with Home Depot, and he kind of knew where I came from and everything and knew that I needed a job. And he said, hey, would you like to come work in loss prevention? I think I was at like $17 an hour. And I was like, sure, I need to do something, right? I still had some money in the account that we had saved from contracting. So that was floating us. And I did that. I worked loss prevention. And that is actually the segue into law enforcement because I didn't know anything about cops or anything. And what I ended up working was a mobile asset protection team that did organized retail crime. And, as you know, organized retail crime involves putting cases together, submitting them to the DA. Sometimes it was even feds. When the big like semis were getting hit, the feds would come in and work those cases. So that was all new to me. I learned about testifying because we would bring cases and I'd have to testify in court. And I started working around all these detectives. And this whole new world to me. I was kind of thinking, okay, this is interesting. Like it's exciting. You get to chase stuff. You get to, problem solve. It's all these puzzles of who did what. And I learned, surveillance, and it was, it's kind of funny learning it all at Home Depot, but the higher up you go, these retail places they're all former detectives that run these, criminal investigation programs. And organized retail crime is like a $8 billion a year issue. So we got into some really good cases. I started working a lot with the DAs, who kind of knew you'd come back and write good paper, et cetera. And then I mentioned my father-in-law was in law enforcement in LA. And I reached a point where I was ready to do something. I was going to go back overseas or something. And he was kind of like, have you ever thought about applying, to be a cop? And I was like, no, I'm not. But, it would allow me to stay home and see my wife, and it would give me a career and everything. So long story short, I joined and was accepted with the LA County Sheriff's Department. So I left. We were in Marietta at the time, moved up to the LA area and went through the Star Academy, which was rough.
What year?
That was in 2012.
And what class number?
Hold on. 390.
So 110 classes between you and I.
Yeah. Yeah. 390 was our class number. I know because I helped design our class t-shirt. I had to do a bunch of mock-ups with 390 in it, but great guys. I still keep in touch with a lot of them. or follow them on social media. You know, they've all kind of spread out. A bunch of them are still with LASD. Some of them went to different agencies around Newport, Irvine, all over the place. One of my good buddies is out in Post Falls, Idaho, out there working now. He's switched. But what a great foundation, though, you know, the academy, just the stress academy they ran. In fact, one of my ramrods I still keep in touch with, awesome guy, just retired, you know, did a full career there, just phenomenal people. You can't beat the experience, you know. So
did you have to go to the jails?
I did. So remember I mentioned earlier, I lateraled to Oceanside during that time, and the jails is pretty much all I did there. So I went to IRC, went downtown, and then I worked towers. And I was there about 2.5 years. I worked a single double. So I was like a vampire. Most of my time there was at night. The only thing I got to do there outside the jails was a couple of the events and parades where we went out to, you know, work North Hollywood. Actually, my first arrest ever on record was working overtime at the North Hollywood Halloween parade. And it was like a 6-foot transgender dude that hit his little boyfriend who was like 5 feet tall in the head with a glass bottle. So we hit him with 245 and I was able to book him. I remember years later going back and looking for that. And it was kind of funny. But that, and I had the opportunity, again, just super blessed. One of the guys over with Haida, his son was in my academy class, and he had been in the Army, was a Black Hawk pilot back in the day. We had talked circa graduation time, and he'd said, "Hey, once you're you know, you're done, you're off training and everything, let me know. I like to pick guys out of the jails to do like buy bus stuff because nobody knows your face and everything." And he's like, you know, I'll talk to your supervisor, make sure it's clear. So, you know, I think probably over a year later, I hit him up on that, and I was able to go out and do a bunch of buy bus stuff in downtown LA, which was awesome experience for me, especially being in the jails. You know, you like worship the patrol guys. They're everything. So I did that, I think, two different times, 2 different ops. We went out as UCs, plainclothes, and just bought a bunch of dope with marked bills.
At that time, what was the average duration that most guys were staying in the jail before they hit patrol?
Years. It was still ridiculous. Years. Oh yeah. I think I was working with guys that had been in there 6 or 7 years. And you understand too, like given my background too, I had no interest in doing that. And I love the department. It was a great opportunity to be there. And I'm grateful for that beginning, but that is too long. It wasn't too long after I had left that they actually went to that, 2-track system, because that was brutal. And it didn't used to be that way. My father-in-law joined in 1982, and he did like a year, maybe. You know, that was the year of the Olympics in LA, and they were moving faster. So
I went through in 92, and at that time, they were telling everybody, anticipate 4 to 6 years.
Yeah, that's
the longest I ever went. Was one of my academy classmates. So we used to do parole hearings down at CJ, and I went for a parole hearing like 9 years after I'd been a cop, and there was still a deputy, you know, just waiting to. Yeah. But on the flip side, they make it hard to leave because of the amount of overtime you can work.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I think the 2-track works so well, because I think there were guys who were like, we just want to stay here. And in my mind, I'm like, let them stay then. Like, let me go. You know, I was on the list for Lakewood, and I think I was getting pretty close at where the 2.5 years, because my guys went to Lakewood like 2 months after I lateraled. So I would have gotten out. But there were other reasons, you know, at the time for leaving. A lot of stuff going on at IRC and over at CJ and all that stuff. So I lateraled out and went straight to patrol with Oceanside PD.
How'd you settle on Oceanside?
Awesome. It was a great department.
No, how'd you pick them? Like, were there multiple agencies?
I had a buddy who went down there first. And the captain, the admin captain at the time, was a guy from industry. So he was like, yeah, we'll take deputies from LASD. I think 3 or 4 of us from my class went to OPD.
And getting into there, what year was that?
well, 12, 13, 14, 2014.
And were you already mentioned previously that you got to a point where you're like, bro, I can't do patrol for another 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
But what were you thinking at that point? Were you thinking long-term, or was this, again, still just a let me get settled and I'll figure it out?
Well, I don't think I knew yet. I mean, coming from the jails, I didn't feel like I had experienced what it was like to be a cop yet, right? So I'd spent all that time, the academy and, the difficulty of getting into LA County. And then deciding to lateral was already tough as it is, because the culture there is like, you don't leave, And, but I wanted to at least say like I was a cop at some point, and I didn't feel like the jails, even though I'd got to do some cool stuff, I hadn't done that yet. So I was just excited to get out and get on the streets and apply, some of my background to a new environment. So OPD was phenomenal. I learned so much there. It was humbling, which is good, I think. A lot of guys coming out of the military and some of the stuff that I did have a hard time transitioning into law enforcement because it's a whole different world. Cops don't care where you came from or what you did, and they have no respect for anyone other than cops. So, that was, and I say humbling in a good way. I think I got checked there by some people that helped me grow. And I still know a lot of guys there, great dudes. So I was, yeah, I mean, it was great being there. I just think that, and maybe this is, I'm not a doctor, but I think that part of that PTSD or kind of mindset when you are coming out of combat operations or other things, is that we're constantly like on the move, right? It's like, I want to get back to that. I want to do that again. And that for a while defined all these moves I made because I kept jumping. I'm chasing that high, right? I had been very familiar with DSS and the State Department because when I was with Blackwater, the RSOs or regional security officers were special agents. They were like, if you can imagine, like the officers for Blackwater, and then the supervisors would be Blackwater, sergeants. They didn't call them that, but that's kind of how it was arranged. So I always saw them around because every embassy had an RSO, and I was always interested in like, how do you get there? You're not a contractor; it's a career. They had badges, and they were so multifaceted. They did all this different kind of stuff, but I didn't have a 4-year degree. So when I first came back, I had buddies that were at State Department who had successfully transferred over, who were sending me info on like job openings and this and that, but I couldn't get around the fact that I didn't have a degree. So that's the one thing I did do when I was in the jails, while some guys were watching movies. I was going to school, so I did a like a night school for adults, and got my bachelor's degree in business management before I left LA County. And then, so I was already thinking like I knew I wanted to do that, right? So I get down, I get to patrol, and you kind of reset your brain because there's a lot to learn. You got to get off training, you got to get out there and learn the streets. And then I think it was probably 2 years into it, there wasn't any openings with State Department. And then the hiring process is difficult as it is. So eventually I get a heads up. Someone there is like, hey, this window's going to open because there was a hiring freeze. We're going to open and have your stuff ready, right? And I threw my stuff in, and when it opened, and from that point, it was like 1.5 years, because you're talking, the scope background, your TS clearance, at State, we had the highest clearance you could have, the TS SCI, which is way up there. And it just takes a long time. So yeah, I mean, it took forever, which allowed me to just, keep going at patrol and focus. And looking back now, I'm so grateful for that time because those foundations made me such a better special agent, right? The feds hire people who are like grocery store managers with no background. So if you come in with any kind of LE background, I mean, you're a star, right? We understand the criminal process, the Constitution, the court process. All of that is new to people coming from the civilian world. So when I finally got picked up, it was like another long road of training, right? At this point, I'm getting real tired of like resetting and going to these boot camps, right? I mean, I did the Army twice, had to go to boot camp. I did Blackwater's little, can you be here training 30-day NDOC. And I went to this, the academy in LASD. Like I'm like, at this point, my back and my knees are feeling this. State's a little bit laid back on that side. It's more of a gentleman's course, but it's a long process, right? You have you got to go to CITP and FLETC to get your criminal investigations sort of, it's like the post for feds. And then each agency has their workup, which was ours, is called BSAC, a Basic Special Agents course. And, it took like a year where you're like back in Northern Virginia and you're doing driving and all this stuff. I finally get it.
Is it a year continuous, or are they doing it like in segments where you're coming back home and then going back and coming back home?
No, there's no break. It's just like, when does the next group start? So like, so we were living in California, so I guess technically that's home, but like we moved. We were renting out here anyways. So I brought my family out. At the time, they would pay for our lodging. And, in the foreign service, your family goes everywhere with you. If you go overseas, they go with you. So it's not uncommon. Everybody had their families with them. So basically my wife and our kids, we lived out of hotels for a year, which is a fun adventure. I'm sure, if you have my wife on, she'll tell you a different version of the story, but it was fun while it lasted. We were in...
probably got old really quick.
Yeah. We were very mobile. We were on, I think the longest break was FLETC. She came home for FLETC because that's Glencoe. Nobody wants to live in Glencoe, Georgia. People that eat alligators down there are there. But I did that. And then we came back. My first assignment was the LA field office. So lo and behold, the Roy Ball Federal Building is like, right across the street from Towers. So here I am years later, yet again, driving into downtown LA. This is a mind trip, man. I'm living in the same area out east, commuting, 2.5 hours, but this time I got to take home and, I'm going to the Federal Building. That office, we covered the entire Southwest region, including Hawaii and Samoa and Guam. So we had a big area to cover. And while I was there...
How many agents are assigned to like an office that size?
It ebbs and flows. I don't know the exact... I think there's a set number that like...
Ballparkish.
Well, let's see. How many supervisory agents were there? I would say there's probably 14 or 15.
Now, is that considered a big field office for them?
LA is definitely a major one, right? NIFO in New York would be one of the biggest ones, but they're very different as far as purpose, right? So NIFO's big because they have this huge protective mission. You have the UN there, you have UNGA that happens every year, the UN General Assembly, which is one of the largest events in the world for protection. A lot of people, we talk about, everybody knows the Secret Service because they see them on TV, but they kind of have one mission, right? Diplomatic Security Service it has this massive mission. Nobody protects more people anywhere in the world than DSS does. We had more missions, more protective missions, more protectees. It's just any foreign national that's designated a protective team comes to DSS, right? We do like we did the royal family. I worked for the Saudis for a while on the Sierra detail, which was the Saudi ambassador detail. It's just massive operation. And in between that, you have criminal investigations, because everything involving passports and identity and documents that would get a foreign national into the U.S. comes over to us. And you can imagine where that string takes you, right? You get into counterterrorism and human trafficking. So in LA, I worked, and then I ended up getting assigned to the Eurasian Task Force. I worked at like Russian and Armenian organized crime. That led me to another case, and I got a seat in Vegas at the Southern Nevada Counterterrorism Center, where I was able to work counterterror out there for a while from LA. So I had like a desk and an office that Vegas Metro, which is an awesome department, set us up with a desk and a computer there. And I would basically make trips out, go work for a week, come back. But we covered that area anyways. So gosh, that we could probably do a whole talk on just what DS does. I mean, it's a broad topic, but I long story short, we finished in LA, finished in Vegas. I went to DC and was working the Saudi team. And in between there, I did a bunch of other stuff. I did a trip to the border of Syria. We're doing inherent resolve stuff and workups at a friendly nation nearby. Did that for 4 months. I was an ARSO there. And then came back, kept working in DC. And then basically our domestic time was done. So now we had this is where my life really bifurcated. So I had just made tenure. I had been promoted, right? I got my tenure with the feds. It's a big deal. You're kind of forever locked in to that job. And then I get word that my dad passed away. And we knew it was coming, but it happened rather quickly. He had early onset cognitive issues, and he went downhill. And like at the end, it went pretty quick. So that really hit, I think, our family in general as to like, where are we going to spend the next 20 years? Because with state, you have domestic assignments, but most of your time is you're in the foreign service, you're overseas. So we were looking at basically just leaving and maybe coming back to visit, but you're talking 15 years, we're out of country. And then, I got my in-laws that, that are here, and now my dad's gone. My mom's alone back here in the States.
Was your mom and dad in South Carolina when he passed away?
No, they were in Arizona. So this is, years later. They were living in Arizona, just outside of Phoenix. And now with my mom had always been a stay-at-home mom. My dad's gone. I didn't know what she was going to do. And I think just more than ever, for the first time, probably since, that original combat mission, I kind of just took a deep breath and was like, all right, let's slow down here. What am I doing? Right. I had started to get way more interested in politics since spending all that time in DC. And I knew we weren't gonna continue and go overseas. And I told my wife, we'll go back, and her family's in California. So then I mentioned, I had the opportunity to come over to San Diego SO. They were amazing, brought me on faster than any department ever has. A very expedited process. And it was a strange transition again. I mean, I turned in my take-home car, took off my suit, and within 3 weeks, I was working patrol again in uniform in North County, San Diego. And I mentioned I wasn't there that long because I had some political aspirations, and I ended up running for Congress, which I'll get to in a second. But during my time at San Diego, just everybody I worked for was great. I mean, it was a great department. I had some really neat opportunities that I don't think didn't expect any department to offer me. They TDY'd me over to SID, a narco team, and I ended up being there for like 7 months, working UC with them, which was, what a privilege, And then right before I had left, I had promoted up to a gang investigation spot up north. So very, very fast movement. They were very good to me as a lateral, which I think they are in general with people. They made very good use of their time, and there's some great guys. Just talked to one of my LTs last week, who was the guy that brought us up to the gangs. Just a phenomenal guy. So enjoyed my time there. It was a good transition to come back. We needed a base. Bought a house. It was the first time we'd ever bought a house in our whole career. And then I had the opportunity to run for Congress. And I jumped full, head first into that. And that was another world.
Making that transition, it's one thing to be interested in politics. It's one thing to follow politics closely. Obviously, every one of us can complain about some aspect of the political machine that is our country. But when you decide to make that transition, you didn't start small. You didn't think like, let me cut my teeth and run for a city council spot or something. How does that happen?
I'm sure there are those who would say like, yeah, I should have done that. I disagree, and I'll tell you why. So I love history, right? I love the beginnings of America and how it came about. And I love a lot of the characters that are in that. What you don't see is exactly that. You don't see a lot of like, before you make a difference, start down here running for city council or something. And I'm not saying city council can't make a difference, but that's a calling. I mean, you have to want to be involved in city council level. Given my background and kind of what I was bringing to the table, I wanted to address geopolitical issues. I wanted to have a national impact. Even at the state level, I wanted to talk about crime, right? We could go on and on about crime in California. And the best place for that was not like a city council race. Second of all, that's messy in of itself. There has to be an opening. You have to, you're limited to where you live basically to run. A congressional run is open to anyone. It's a federal position. And I was looking for a national platform because I wanted to talk about stuff. We didn't get into it, but, I was involved in the fall of Kabul a little bit from the state side on some private stuff that we did. I wanted to I wanted a platform to speak truth so that I could speak up for, my fellow law enforcement folks and my military guys and even the guys in the government. I wanted to tell truth where I thought there was a big lack of truth. I thought, as I mentioned earlier, there's all these bureaucrats, many of whom have no personal experience in the real world. Even those with good intentions. We have some folks on our side, I could say, who are politicians, but a lot of them are like, you look at their pattern, it's like they did exactly that. They get involved, they intern for a politician, and they do the city council thing, and it's just like, it's like people who go to school for 25 years and never practice, right? I was trying to bring in the whole, no, my 20 years in public service has been in the real world. Now I want to step in and speak on behalf of people. The other reason I thought that was really, really important is because I believe there is something to be said for the American way of leadership, which is you don't get to just stand up and represent people because you're angry about an issue. The American way is to be duly elected. It's when people say, we want you to speak for us. And you see that, right? You see that guys like George Washington and Franklin and all these other founders were really involved in their communities, or they were people of status or something where people trusted them, go and speak for us. So I wanted to do that the right way. I wanted to speak out and I wanted to have that platform, but I wanted to run to have that, that position legitimized. Now, of course, I had no idea what I was getting into. I'd never been involved in politics, and this was a fire hose learning experience. I ran in Orange County and part of San Diego County. The 49th district is both North County, San Diego, and South Orange County. The incumbent is a far left Marxist, member of the squad. And we lost that seat years ago when a Republican vacated to go to a different district, and we've never got it back. I had some good recommendations, some good people kind of backing me. I had, great talk with some state assembly people and a state senator. And I even had a 25 minute conversation with Mike Pompeo about running, because I had worked for him, when I was at State Department. So I was encouraged, when I went into it. But learning the political system in California was eye-opening. And this is eventually, you're going to see the beginning of why I'm now doing a nonprofit called Defining Truth, because what I learned during that run was that we can't even start with the left. We're not fighting these extreme Marxists, progressive Marxists. We have a lot of issues to deal with in our own system, right? In our own party, if you're a Republican. And that was frustrating because, you think back over all the stuff that I've talked about, growing up, love of country, love history, appreciating the values that were instilled, where all those values came from, how Western civilization was founded. And then I get into politics and I see this just perpetual infatuation with money, and they don't even care half the time if you're winning a race. It's like, how much money did you raise? And that was angry. So I met some great people out there, but a lot of people in California are spinning their wheels because you're battling desires up in Sacramento versus the grassroots. And there's just always this kind of fight of who's going to win. And I saw the dirty side behind the curtain of how endorsements are handed out and, what kind of people they back. And a lot of it centers around money. How much money do you have? So, essentially, if you're independently wealthy or retired and have an endless stream of cash, if you can throw millions of dollars into your own campaign, you're virtually guaranteed you're going to get the endorsement from the Republican Party, which a lot of people have a problem with. Now, you can fight them, and there has been cases of people that fought against, they didn't get the endorsement and they end up winning, and that's great, but it's rare. And so the majority of your time running, you have to spend begging people for money. You got to be on the phone. You got to be calling people. Now, you can see how that's a class difference already, because if you're coming from the silver spoon, elite, Ivy League schools, your circle of friends or influence are going to be able to cut you large checks, right? But if you're coming from public service, blue collar, your friends are going to toss you $25 and you got to find 1 million of them, right? Or come up with your own money somehow. So, look, we did great. We did really well when we engaged with people, because anytime I had the opportunity to speak to people, we did phenomenal. but that is what you need money for, is to reach people. Because if you don't raise money, people don't know who you are. And if they don't know who you are, they can't vote for you. So we ended up getting a lot of support in Orange County, not nearly enough in San Diego. And there was like 7 of us that were running for the same seat. It was a disaster. And then, the Democrat ended up winning that seat anyways. Nobody on our side won. So in the wake of that, right now I'm faced with, okay, I 100% believed that was a calling. I was going to run. I'm going to do it. And to get involved, right? I don't think the calling is to necessarily win. It's like, are you doing the right thing or not? And if that's where I was, like, yes, I'm supposed to be doing this, then we had a big decision to make, because it's like, well, do I hang it up and just go back, put on the uniform and go back to working, dope and gang cases? Or like, was what I said, 7 months ago legitimately, this is what you should be involved in? So I had these 2 things going, like we talked about. I had my security consulting group, which was already formed, like business-wise, but we came into a contract that would allow me to step away from an actual job. And then I wanted to stay involved in politics, but we found that there was a lot of work to do on the culture war side, more so than just running for office, which I haven't canceled out in the future, but not right now. So immediately, this opportunity to start defining truth came up. I started working on this book that I wrote, and the book was a direct response to the culture war issues that I was dealing with. So to sum that up quickly, I kept running into a group of people who they have no convictions. They had no beliefs on really anything. Everything was just, whatever. It was geared towards winning, but they were missing the conviction side. Like, well, what do you believe in? And that was a problem. Even strategically, as an analyst, you can look at that and say that's a problem, because if our enemy, our opposition, are true believers, I mean, they 100% believe, right? You are evil, you're a racist bigot if you're not a Democrat, on and on and on. And a lot of what they were saying was premised on falsehoods, but there was no counter to that lie. Right. Hence all the BLM nonsense, and how BLM is going around doing their nonsense. And they're trained Marxists. They hate America. They hate, Christian values, which are behind a lot of American Western civilization. And they were using all their money to pay for like transgender strip shows for elementary school kids. In New York alone, they spent $285,000 on strip shows for kids, and that and their mansions. Their $10 million mansions that they built. So I was looking at all this like, it's just a bunch of lies. People are being deceived, and no one on our side was telling the truth at all. So I started writing the book where basically,
real quick question. From your experience being involved in this, how much of that machine is outside of these groups and being driven by the media and their desire to make money?
I think you got to go one step further. It's not media, it's who's behind the media.
Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
And granted, I applaud you for jumping in the pool of politics, mm-hmm. that you had the conviction to even give it a try. Because I would imagine, like you mentioned, even though you aligned yourself with a Democratic group, you said, I'm a Republican. Hey, Republican Party, mm-hmm. I'm one of you guys. Was there a bit of, yeah, but you're the outsider. Mm-hmm. You haven't played with this team for the last 20 years. That guy has. So I would imagine there was a lot of things even within your own group that were eye-opening, mm-hmm. that you were fighting an uphill battle to begin 100%. With. 100%.
But that is the trend nowadays. That's the war that we're in. I mean, ask Chad Bianco, right? Like, talk about jumping in and challenging someone, right? And the first time around, like, that didn't go too well for him. They stuck him in an admin office and took his position, and when he was running for sheriff. But what he did is he saw something he didn't like, and he was like, I can do that better. And you have to cut the system in order to. There are times throughout history when you play the game and you wait your turn. But during tumultuous times when change is needed, you have to be a disruptor, because the concept of an old school group that's failing to do their job, saying you can have your turn in 50 years, you have to disrupt that, right? You have to say, no, you're not doing it. You're failing, and we can do a better job. But in order to take that spot, you gotta anger some people. You have to say, no, I'm going to run. I'm going to challenge you because you're failing, and nobody likes to hear that. But we've seen that happen all over the place. I mentioned Chad. That happens at the department level every time there's an election or a battle for chief or whatever it is, and it definitely happens in politics. Except for there's a lot more money and a lot more dirt on the politics side because it's money. It's all money. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, there was definitely people who felt that way, but there's a raging civil war, within politics on all sides. You look at what's happening this week. The Democrats are dealing with this too. Mm-hmm. After the debate, now for the first time, many of us watching the Biden performance over the last few years, we've seen this cognitive decline. We see the way he behaves. And even I mentioned my dad, passing away from those issues. I can look at Biden and say, you obviously have cognitive issues. You're on the decline. You can't walk upstairs. You can't speak. You mumble. You don't make any sense when you say things. Now, just like I'm describing on the Republican side, there's a lot of infighting. Now the Democrats are panicking. They have a major civil war because what are they going to do? You have mainstream media suggesting he needs to step down. Nancy Pelosi today said it's legitimate to question his mental status. That's new. Right. So what they did is some insiders around the Biden admin, they've known this for a while. You have Jill kind of controlling what happens. You have his family, which are real deep in money with China, et cetera. They've been managing everything like a puppet. But now that they let that debate happen, it's like they just pulled the top off and the whole world sees what's happening and they can't deny it anymore. I mean, Jake Tapper on CNN yesterday is saying it's time to replace him.
I think we as a country need to really revisit, and I know this will ruffle some feathers, the same way there's a minimum age to be the president, we really need to consider a maximum age. I don't care what side of the political fence you're on. There comes a certain point that you age out of being able to be an effective president. Are there one-off people who are in their 70s and very with it cognitively, physically? Yes, but it is not the norm.
Well, and in a way, there is that process, which is why you have the 25th Amendment that allows you to remove someone who's unfit. Just the truth is that no party ever wants to do that, right? So technically there is a process for that, which is all the talk this morning on the news is like, okay, well, let's do the 25th Amendment. But that's why you have like even Trump submitted to, a cognitive test or a mental test or whatever. So, I mean, they do monitor that, but the reality is like making it happen is extremely difficult because obviously each opposing party has a vested interest in removing that incumbent.
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It goes back to the machine that's actually operating behind them that really has the bigger control.
Yeah, I was very hesitant. I'm not a conspiracy theory guy, and I was very hesitant to jump on things that you see on social media quickly. I like to analyze and investigate and think about it. Okay. I don't take saying or claiming things about the government lightly, but I will say this 100% that over the last 4 years, I have learned that there is such a thing in the proverbial swamp. That is a very real thing. There's a lot of moving parts that the American public simply just doesn't know about. And even those that do, they say it, but they don't really know what they're talking about or who it is. And you're seeing that play out in real time right now, right? Like you have a president in office who clearly is not fit to be there. Like you watch that debate and realize that that's the guy making decisions on when we disastrously pulled out of Afghanistan. You know what really struck me during that conversation, talk about seeing the puppet masters. I noticed that when Trump and Biden were debating, every time Trump said something about like the reality of the world or America, Biden looked shocked, like he'd never heard that before. And it's almost like they've kept him in the White House almost secluded from the reality of what's going on because he's not running the country. You have other people around him making decisions. Like his perspective on Afghanistan is absolutely delusional. That was the biggest act of treason anyone has ever committed in this country. I mean, you're talking, we abandoned allies. We had thousands of people are dead because of what Biden did, including the Americans and the Marines who were killed at Abbey Gate. But not only that, it goes way deeper. You're talking $86 billion worth of advanced equipment, technology, weapons that we just handed over to the enemy. And we knew that. The generals knew that. The Biden administration knew that. We left all of that there. We capitulated to an enemy that we had beat. The Taliban wasn't doing anything in Afghanistan. There was hardly any casualties in Afghanistan at all. There was no reason for us to leave. Young girls, for the first time in history, were going to school and learning. They were able to walk around in public with men. Democracy was growing in a new generation that had spent 20 years under the ideals that America offered them. And in a split second, he stabbed everyone in the back and abandoned everyone there, got Americans killed, and literally aided and abetted America's greatest opponents. The Chinese and the Russians did not shut their embassies down. Okay, they immediately came in to advise, assist, to help. China signed a minerals deal with the Taliban right away. And it goes against all common sense and understanding of counterterrorism, where we allow failed nation states obviously proliferate the existence of terrorist groups. We've created the biggest one on earth. And we immediately, people knew that was happening, and everything went dark. I mean, it went dark overnight. So again, we could talk about Afghanistan if you want, but that debate showed America how bad Biden really is. And my question is, who's running the country? Who should be, who are we going to hold responsible for what he did in Afghanistan? Because, already that's come back to visit us. I mean, there are weapons that we left in Afghanistan that showed up in the October 7th attacks in Israel. We just arrested 8 ISIS members throughout the U.S., 2 in San Diego, 2 in Chicago, I believe, and 2 in New York. Open border. We could go on and on about that. The country is absolutely disintegrating. And for any, students of history, it's the Cloward-Piven strategy, right? Cloward-Piven were professors. They were married, a man and a woman, back in the 60s, who believed that this new type of progressive Marxism could be implemented by purposefully overloading a system to the point where it disintegrated and the federal government had to help. It forced people to step in, thereby allowing that totalitarian regime to step in. They were very open about it. Cloward and Piven were communists, very outspoken communists. They hated America. They wanted universal healthcare, universal income, all that stuff, right? One paycheck for everybody, regardless of how high you are or how good you work. And Cloward-Piven was mainly focused on income, right? So their goal was to overload the welfare system. They wanted everyone in inner cities and black communities and Hispanic communities, they wanted them all down, not succeeding. That's what the Democrats are trying to do. They want them all down, poor, and dependent on the government because they count on their vote and they control people. That's Cloward-Piven. Now, if you can imagine, that is on steroids now. You look at the border, you look at geopolitical situation around the world, they have Cloward-Pivened our entire country, purposefully overloading it, destroying our infrastructure, allowing enemies to take a front row in decisions, right? Who's going to be held accountable for this stuff? It's insane. Everybody knows this, by the way. A lot of people in public service don't want to say it out loud, right? Because it sounds scary. But come on, let's be real. The whole country is sitting here thinking, is there going to be a civil war? What's happening, right? Everyone's asking that. And I'm simply looking at it from an analytical perspective. I'm not saying we should do this or that. I'm just saying that is what's happening right now. And this recent debate with Biden and Trump was really interesting because it just blew the top off of, what was going on in the admin. And the question is why did they do that? And who did it, right? I have 2 sort of perspectives on what occurs next. Everybody's waiting for Newsom to step in and see if he'll, try to run. We have no evidence of that yet. But you have scenario 1 where Biden willingly steps down. And I don't think that's going to happen based on statements he just made. And he willingly steps down, somebody else steps in. I think that would have to entail some sort of big money for the Biden family.
See, that's where not that I'm a conspiracy theorist, and not that I delve into politics more than a superficial, but that's why I think it is that I do honestly believe that behind the scenes, behind the curtain, there are people, groups, whatever you want to call them, that control the country. They allow somebody to come to the pivot, and be the figurehead for that given time, whoever the president's going to be. for him to step down is because the money behind him is going to say, Joe, this is the plan that's in place. Here's what we're going to do. That's just me. That's the outsider who reads the headline, doesn't read the article. That's how I see it. I don't see him just kind of one day going, yeah, you know what? Peace, I'm out of here.
Well, and I agree with you. But like, I don't think that Biden even has the wherewithal he doesn't even know what's going on anymore. He can't even walk off a stage and go the right direction, right? He's a sundowner. You see the hours, recently someone inside tweeted or X'd now that basically his hours of operation like end at 4 p.m. or whatever it was. That's
at the end of the day, he's isn't he 81?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, age is a factor. It goes back to age is a factor. I don't care what you say.
Well, age and the fact that he's lived such a corrupt, long career where money has played a factor in everything he did. I mean, half the stuff that they tried to indict Trump for, Biden actually did, right? You talk about Ukraine and saying, I'm going to withhold $1 billion. That's quid pro quo. They tried to charge Trump with that. I mean, it's insane. They've weaponized everything. Yeah, I mean, here's a problem, though. If Biden... from what we've heard recently, his statements are aligned with not wanting to leave. And, and that could be because, well, he's thinking, well, hey, I'm getting older. Money doesn't mean as much to me at this point. Now, Jill wants the money. She's younger and she's got accustomed to that lifestyle. But if he doesn't want to leave, they're going to have to do something else, which is what I think if you read a lot of the headlines this morning with Pelosi saying it's legitimate to question his health, that's a big deal because that is an open door to the 25th Amendment where it's not even the Republicans that are going to try to push the 25th, although some are. Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, just said something about it. But if you have Pelosi saying that, that means the Democrats themselves it's almost a threat. It's like, okay, Biden, if you're not going to step down, we're going to 25th you. We're going to say you're unfit. We're going to get Jill to jump on. Your son's been indicted because he's a crackhead. Like, who do you have left, If he refuses to step down, I think they'll force it. And then the internal battle will be with Kamala, because then the question is, what happens to Kamala, right? Nobody wants Kamala to be president. Kamala lives in like space. I mean, I don't know if you ever heard her talk. It's difficult to understand what's going on in her head. They definitely don't want her. So there is a big civil conflict brewing within the Democratic Party. And all of this, by the way, has to come to a head like now. And if you look to add to their frustration, the recent SCOTUS decisions involving the Trump immunity case is just a major blow to them. Major blow, because basically the Supreme Court said, look, of course you're not immune from committing crimes, but you guys framed everything as if his official acts should be punished criminally. And they're like, that's not how it works. Are we going to hold Obama criminally responsible for drone striking American citizens outside of due process? No, they don't want that either, right? And they pointed that out in their writing. So that mixed with the Chevron decision, which Supreme Court just handed down, it literally said we put a gravestone on this issue. That was basically the power of bureaucracies and agencies to act upon American citizens without, a law or a bill being created. And the Supreme Court was like, well, too much power. You can't do that. See, the Democrats have relied heavily on that bureaucratic power. I mean, they weaponized the entire government by all these federal agencies. They're not elected. They're bureaucrats. So the new admin comes in. They're like, boom, you're in charge of FBI. You're in charge of DOD. You're in charge of EPA. And then they chose these far left extreme Marxists and they're like, go do our bidding. And they have wreaked havoc on the United States, right?
But from a flip side, I'm 55 years old.
I'm 38.
So I've got a couple more laps around the sun. All of this rhetoric that goes on is nothing new. Mm-hmm. You go back far enough, this same circus and this same merry-go-round has been through every generation. I would almost say, what's your opinion on what's the Great Reset? Because you already mentioned when guys like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and those guys were standing up for this country, there wasn't the machine per se behind them. I would imagine even back then, though, there were some interested parties who stayed quiet. But hey, here's some cabbage for you. Mm-hmm. But where is our reset? Because the same argument that we see with the Democrats, you put a Republican, whoever, 10 years earlier, 10 years from now, when they're in office, they're putting their people in. It's the nature of the beast. But how do we unplug the machine that is politics and bring it back to what's best for the country?
Well, this is why I titled our organization Defining Truth, because I don't think you get anywhere unless you're dealing with reality. To address that directly, we talk about left and right, Democrats, Republicans, but the truth is to properly combat your enemy, you have to understand them, right? It's the art of war. The truth is that the Democrats have completely lost control. We're not talking about Democrats are guys like Bill Maher, okay? Those are the Democrats of the 90s, and they still, saluted the flag and stuff.
He's actually become probably more independent over the last couple
years. He's a Republican. He just doesn't know it. Yeah, but what you're dealing with is something that needs to be clearly articulated, and it's not in politics. And that is, there's been a deep infiltration from America's enemies. The left fully adopted America's enemies ideology, and they've applied it. And they've applied it in ways that people just let fly over their heads. Our education system, our especially places of higher education like colleges and universities, in our bureaucracies, throughout government regulation. You have to understand that we have a lot of opponents around the world. The depth of involvement that the Chinese Communist Party and the Russians and even the IRGC and Iran and others, the depth of involvement is so much more than people realize. Some of us who spent time in the government working stuff like this, we've known this for a long time. And I always had an issue with that, because I get there's things that are classified, but we have a knowledge of the level of involvement of America's enemies in our political system. And nobody talks about it. And I don't know if that's because everyone's compromised. I mean, I certainly worked cases where we found corruption and compromise within. So I know it's real at every level. But that is so much deeper than people realize. Let's just talk about Biden, for example, right? When we're talking about him, we're talking about, well, what are the Democrats going to do, this and that? Okay, but let's take a step back and realize that Hunter Biden was getting millions of dollars a year from the Chinese Communist Party. The Democrats knew that. People within the DOJ knew that, and they didn't do anything. So are we talking treason? Is it ignorance? What is the holdup here, right? He's selling art, for $700,000. Are you kidding me? What is he? He's on the board of a Chinese energy company that's controlled by the Communist Party without any qualifications other than his dad's the big man, right? We have telephone transcripts of him threatening a guy, right, about the big man, is saying, my dad's sitting right next to me, using the office of the president to make money off of foreign enemies. Now, if you know anything about the IC or the intelligence community, spies are good at working people. And you may think that you're the one getting money, but you're not, right? There is a great advantage for the Communist Party to have someone as close to the president as his own son, right? And probably his brother. And obviously Biden knew at that time, because his cognitive was there to answer in a way that indicates his involvement, right? And he's been caught, right, openly. And what's DOJ's response? Why didn't they charge him with a felony? Oh, because his memory's not good. Remember, that was the official response as to why he had classified documents in his Mustang, as they go and pursue the same thing against Trump. So the real question isn't, when you say, well, what's the reset? It's like, we first have to deal with the rot that has infiltrated the United States. We have a foreign enemy that, unfortunately, and that's why our founders used the term domestic and foreign, because they realized that entities can make use of domestic enemies, right? And I don't even think that a lot of these people think of themselves as domestic enemies, because they grew up brainwashed. They went to a school where, you're indoctrinated, and then you go to a college and you're told you should hate yourself and hate America and hate the process. And then they get to the NSA, and what do you think they're going to think? They've been taught their entire life and encouraged by their leaders that you should hate your country and you're evil and you're racist and on and on. It's all lies. Obviously, our enemies benefit the most from that. So, we call it the mind virus on our show at Defining Truth. We're always talking about the mind virus, and it really is like a mind virus, because it's an infection in ideology that makes no rational sense whatever. It's completely detached from reality. This concept that America is anything but the greatest country that's ever existed is absolutely planted by America's enemies. And for some reason, you have entire swaths of American citizens who are like, yeah, we are the worst. We're evil. Like, who do you think that's going to benefit? I'll tell you a story that just blew my mind, but not the person it was directed towards. So I was in a briefing, a training briefing at a location in Northern Virginia. We'll just leave it at that, right? This is a classified area. We're having a briefing that's classified about things
somewhere
going
in the
on,
United States,
things going on in the world, right? And who our enemies are. And I'm in this room. This is this is part of like an orientation training phase. And we're listening to some behind the scenes information on like how things go down and who our enemies are. And there is a young girl in the audience going through this orientation with me who is visibly upset about what she's hearing. And she stands up and she's like, I didn't come here to help spy for America. I want to help people and help people. She was like, almost like she wanted to be like Greenpeace, right? And I remember looking around the room like, dude, is this like an insider threat? Like, what is she talking about, right? She was so mad that our organization would assist in geopolitical, like intel type activity, and just furious that she had been a part of this because she hated America. She had just graduated a well-known Ivy League school because she told us all, right? So in her head, she's like, I'm so smart, no experience in life other than I think she might've done a Greenpeace tour or something. And after the class, because I'm on the sort of tactical side of that orientation group, we were mixed. I went up to the operations guy that was running the little briefing. And I walked up and I said, did you hear that? Like, are you concerned that we have somebody that's like has access to us and what we're doing that is like furious that we're helping our own country? And he's like, oh, that's normal. He's like, I hear it every briefing now. And this was like my entry into that world. And I was like, oh man, we have a huge problem. That right there explains the real mind virus and rot that we have in this country, that we have allowed our enemies to penetrate so deep. They're not recruiting people anymore. They're just sending kids from public schools to work for 3-letter agencies. And you want proof of this? 52 current and former intelligence officers signed a letter, right, stating that that Russian laptop was that Hunter's laptop was Russian disinformation. Remember that? 52 current and former intel. These are smart guys. And every single one of them now has been proven they lied. We knew that information came from the Hillary Clinton campaign during the election. We knew it. It's been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. And they wrote a letter and they signed it and they lied and they distributed it to the mainstream media, the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, all of them, so that they could regurgitate that. Why? In an effort to stop Donald Trump from being the president. That is directly countering the will of the American people. And you lied about it. And they were protected by the Department of Justice. That type of lie comes from a deep belief or conviction that you are the bad guy, that, American citizens that believe in God and country and apple pie are all racist Nazis. If you really believe that, then you're willing to do whatever it takes to stop it. Because after all, you got to stop evil, right? That is the culture that we're dealing with. That is the split. So it goes way beyond like Republican and Democrat. It goes to holding people accountable for this sort of betrayal and abandonment of reality. And the problem is they are true believers, right? And this is what I encountered. So I run for Congress and I realized that the Republicans are just sort of playing around. They think the culture war is a waste of time. And on the left, the culture war is how they're winning the country. It's everything. They're going after your kids. They're going after families. They're going after the concept of what a man and a woman are. I mean, they're attacking from every angle possible. And the Republicans are playing like 1980s politics, like make your phone calls and raise some money. It's like, what are you doing, guys? I think that the Democrats know this. Some of them have sort of come to the realization like, oh, this is getting out of hand, because they welcomed this extreme left into their party. You're real insanos like Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib. I mean, they are legit like crazy bad people, right? They don't believe it, but the things that they accepted and believe that are false make them very dangerous to this country. And I think that some within the party have realized that, but they don't know what to do because they've let them so much in. That's the identity of the left now, which is why you have guys like Bill Maher who are like, what are you guys doing? He's like, I don't believe in God and country, but I'm not a crazy, progressive Marxist. So I think because they know this, hence this deep panic that's setting in, right? This fall is going to be quite the ride because what's coming is a reckoning. I think they know that if Trump gets back into office, right, he's going to bring a bunch of people with him, and they're going to go after. They're going to hold people accountable, right? They're going to go after the DOJ that weaponize themselves politically against American citizens. They're going to go after people who, illegally put people in jail for things like praying in front of an abortion clinic. I mean, their level of extreme has surpassed like even expectations. So I'm hesitant to make specific predictions, but like obviously things are erupting, and coming into this fall is going to be very, very interesting to say the least.
If you look at history in the cyclical nature that it is, and I'll use the example of you had the Depression of the 20s and 30s that led into the free, you could almost call it the free love of the flapper era and the Prohibition.
Yeah.
And it kind of went crazy the other way. And then we went back towards a very conservative era of McCarthy in the 50s and all of that, which brought about the free love and the looseness of the 60s, and which brought back the conservative values and of the 80s. Mm-hmm. And it's just the
pendulum. Yeah.
Do you see that what you're talking about now, where, okay, the Democratic Party accepted in maybe a little farther left than what they're used to. Mm-hmm. And so now the pendulum just has to come back, and we're going to go back into another era. I mean, where I'm getting at, do you think that this swing back and forth just goes on in perpetuity?
I think you're spot on with the pendulum concept. I talk about that all the time. But what happens historically is it breaks. So the question everybody is wondering is, when is it going to break? That's where, especially this current season right now, we've entered into a very new area, uncharted territory, because the pendulum's never swung this far. I agree with you, right? But let's take a country like Germany, for example, right? Even before World War I, right? You have the Prussian War. You have a country that, if you look at like political statements and things the Kaiser said back in that day, they were very much like, we believe in these values. They even talked about like biblical values and stuff like that. And what happened in Germany is they had their own version of Democrats, right? Different, but same end goal, that eventually would become National Socialist in Germany. And that degradation, that lack of taking these issues seriously, that pendulum swung back and forth until it snapped. And what's so ironic is the Democrats like to think in their mind like Trump's the fascist or whatever. But the truth is that they are the fascist. That's how it happens. Like, that's the exact same thing that National Socialists said in Germany, right? They had to get rid of all the Jews, and they had to, tear down the elites in the government, and they are the Nazis. So the question is like, where's that pendulum going to snap? Because remember, that went back and forth with Germany, right? They lost territory in the late 1800s, and then you go into World War I, and they're absolutely decimated. There's a great national shame in Germany because the French even make them sign in the car in the Treaty of Versailles, and they're just nationally shamed. They got this huge debt, all this money that Europeans said, you owe us this money, especially France, and you know that it's very heavy on their minds in the German psyche, because what happens when the Nazis push into Paris? They take it in 4 days, and of course Hitler makes the French surrender in that train car, right? It's like a look, we got you back. And so that pendulum had swung back and forth from like defeat, victory, defeat, and then you have the beginning of the National Socialist years with Hitler, where all of a sudden the economy's booming and there's this national identity and they're all happy because they got what they wanted. But if you look at what they went after, and it's so ironic with the left, how they talk, they're just completely ignorant of history. They first had to shut churches up. They wanted pastors to be quiet. There's a great, a story with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was one of the pastors in Germany who resisted the Nazi Party. In more recent times, Eric Metaxas has wrote a book called Letter to the American Church, which is phenomenal. I suggest, anybody listening read it. And he traces the progress of how when the church, which was a foundation for the culture, basically surrendered to the government, it was the beginning of the end. And then, of course, we know the end results was Hitler's executing pastors. Dietrich Bonhoeffer gets executed. He's killed by the Nazis. And you reach this point where like, there ain't no freedom of religion or worship anymore. You're worshiping Hitler or you're dead, right? And so you see very, very similar patterns even in America, which I go into a lot on my nonprofit side about how churches in America have tried to play this like, oh, I'm not political, I want to take a middle ground. But really what they're doing is they're cowards. They've taken a stance that says, we're not going to speak out about values and morals that matter, because they don't understand that those are the foundations of first world institutions. And when you strip those away, you fall. And what's so ironic is the left knows it. That's why they're attacking them. You stop and wonder, like, why does the left spend so much time going after little kids, right? With over-sexualizing them, porn in schools for first graders, talking about anal sex and all these, stuff. They're like, what in the world? These little kids talking about this? It's not an accident. They know exactly what they're doing. They're detaching children from the traditional concept of a core family. The core family, as described by the Christian Judeo perspective, is at the very center of what America is. And the left knows that. And they've always known that. Hitler talked about it. Stalin talked about it. Guys like Antonio Gramsci talked about it in progressive Marxism. He's like, hey, we got to separate families. I'm working on a second book right now, and I was sort of delving in and researching the People's First Commissar for Welfare. There's this lady in the Soviet Union. And she wrote extensively about the need to separate children from the concept of a traditional marriage, because that's how the government would take power. And you're like, dude, we're watching this happen right now. So the culture war is very important. They know it matters. Those values matter. And my whole thing, like I talk about in the book, is like, you don't have to be a Christian. It behooves you to support people with those values, because that's where all of our liberties and freedom came from. So if you love America and you love the concept of the American dream and the liberties we enjoy, then you're going to vote for people that uphold these Christian Judaic values, because that's where they all come from, right? If you abandon that, it's like stripping the foundation out from underneath a tower. The tower is going to fall. What else do you premise it on? Well, you have human secularism, which has been tried and failed throughout history. You look at just the 19th century alone, or the 20th century alone, and you have more people dead through secularist governments than the previous 19 centuries combined. That's an astronomically high number. And it wasn't because of religion. It wasn't because of religious wars. It was because of secular governments that replaced the idea of God with a government and said, we can do better, right? We'll control. The result of that, the Soviets, the Nazis, the North Korean regime, mass human poverty, starvation, mass murder, and death. That's what happens. And you want to talk about a pendulum. That has happened over and over again. And all the while, you've had this sort of allied, group of countries that held on to these Western values, these biblical values that were like, hey, we believe in the value of human life. It's where we derive our stance on abortion and pro-life issues, and on the value of marriage and sanctity of life, etc. And we've always contradicted these extreme secular governments that have led to mass death. You're talking hundreds of millions of people dead. And for some reason, every so often that pendulum swings back, and people are like, let's try it again. And that's what's happening right now, clearly. Like you mentioned that golden era in the 1920s. We have the same pattern reoccurring now. And I see it on the news, and I see it on the conservative side, which is frustrating for me. You see a group of people that are so frustrated with geopolitical or outside problems that they become isolationist, and they're like, screw everybody else, let's just take care of us. Well, that's not how the world works, right? You have to be proactive. It's the broken windows concept in law enforcement. It's like, let's be forward and address these issues. But isolationism was huge after World War I, because Americans were like, let's not get involved. And what that leads to, a passive, weak leader, leads to the rise of groups like the National Socialists and the Nazis. Because while America was like, we don't want to get involved in Europe again, slowly but surely that demon rose. And One by one, he took France, he took North Africa, he went into Poland, he eventually turned and attacked the Russians. He joined up with Mussolini and the Italians. I mean, this evil grew and grew and grew until we were forced to enter, right? Upon penalty of like the entire world falling under this regime. And then it cost us, hundreds of thousands of American lives. And so some of us right now are looking at like, hey, we've seen this pendulum a lot. Let's stop this before it happens, or there's going to be a big price to pay. But unfortunately, like throughout history, people just sort of live in la la land. They don't think it's going to happen. They don't get involved in local politics. It's kind of a scary time,
I unfortunately think that the one thing throughout history is I honestly believe the average person doesn't get involved beyond arm's reach. Mm-hmm. Whatever goes on in their periphery of their daily life is what they're impacted by. And for a lot of people, it may not be isolationist. It may just be, you know what? It's just not important to me. Almost an apathy. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if other countries in the world, for their younger generation, are seeing the same level of apathy that I think because I even look at what's coming into the military today, what's coming into the first responder community today. And I believe that there is a bit of apathy. I don't really take it to the point of I don't care. It's just I don't care that much. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if other countries around the world are seeing that same thing in their younger members of their countries.
Well, I think they have, and many have fallen because of that. We're not unique or original as far as the rise and fall of empires, right? Those bubbles pop. And if you look at the patterns, it's very similar. And part of it is that apathy where people just don't care. I think you see that in the Roman Empire. You see that they grew and the expanse of the Roman Empire was so massive that this apathy set in, this comfort in like, we're done with wars. We have Rome. You had entire generations that grew up under Roman peace, the Pax Romana, and it was just like, we're chill. We don't need to do anything. And it led to their demise. You could say the same for America in that you have a generation of people that has no concept of how these liberties were obtained. They don't know what it's like to suffer. They don't know what it's like to work hard. They have no appreciation for the freedoms that we enjoy. And so it's like until a war smacks you in the face, they don't wake up. I think that's happened before, but I think we've reached a level that's unprecedented in American history. You mentioned other countries. I think it's pretty clear. I've worked in numerous other countries, foreign countries, and it's a totally different culture than it is in America, right? There isn't a sort of esprit de corps to like, let's get together and fight for what we have. In fact, that's why a lot of them suffer so much, because they don't do that in a way that's uniquely Western civilization based, right? It's a big thing in America. Americans were like, let's take on the British. A lot of countries around the world are not willing to do what our founders did in the American Revolution. And the results speak for themselves. You don't get your own country. You're overrun by, look at just south of us, cartels run Mexico. It's out of control. The level of violence and cartel activity in Mexico is 10 times that of Pablo Escobar back in the day. And we barely even talk about it. We could say the same for a lot of Middle Eastern countries who deal with dictatorships and everything. Because if you've groomed an entire generation to be dependent on the government, then that's exactly what you get. They don't want to be involved. They don't want to fight, right? This is why the culture war matters so much, because fighting for what you believe is exactly that. It's self-explanatory. You have to believe in something. Good fighters are motivated by what they believe. That's huge, right, in warfare psychology. So what do you do with a country that doesn't believe in themselves anymore, right? What the left is doing in American psyche and American ideology? How do you think that's going to affect our Marines, our Army, our Air Force? Where are the young men willing to storm the beaches of Normandy? When you lose those beliefs and ideals, you start to disintegrate, because not only does the quality of your fighters go down, but the insider threat, as we've discussed, goes way up. And that's that mind virus. That's a sickness that we've dealt with. And you can see you look around the world at other, foreign countries where they don't believe in their dream anymore. There isn't a unified concept. It's kind of just like everybody for themselves. I said isolationist. It's very much apathy as well. It's just like, I'm just going to take care of me and my own. And I, by the way, I've heard that a lot recently in conservative circles. People saying, I'm just going to, get my cabin in the mountains and disappear and take care of my family. And I'm like, okay, well, the problem with that is that doesn't work when society crumbles, right? Because if you're just worried about yourself, first of all, it's selfish. Second of all, you're just going to get raided by some group that gets together. They're going to murder you and they're going to take your food, right? So what's more important is strong communities that rely on duly elected people, like I was saying earlier, right? That's the American way. It's not, and I know people would disagree with me on this, but it's not the like dressing up like Buffalo guy running into the Capitol, right? The idea is that you are duly chosen by people to represent them and speak for them, then act on their behalf, right? Anything other than that is like you're just committing treason. This is what happened with if you look at the story of John Brown, right? Just prior to the Civil War, John Brown was an abolitionist. He was very zealous in his belief, and I'm not saying he was wrong, but he was like, I'm not waiting. And he led a revolt. He freed a bunch of slaves. They attacked Harper's Ferry, right? They got into a fight with the army. And of course, all of them get killed. John Brown is captured and they hang him for treason. And by the way, he's hung by the same administration that ends up writing the Declaration of Independence. I'm sorry, the Emancipation Proclamation. Get my timeframes mixed up. So the lesson there is like too soon, not duly elected or chosen, right? He jumped the gun. He was all adamant about let's start a war, let's free the slaves. He didn't do it the right way. He didn't have the right support or the right backing. You wait a couple years later and you have Lincoln talking about emancipation, and you have a war that's backed by an entire, nation, and they're duking it out. So
don't we do that though as human beings? You get somebody with an idea. That idea is on par with somebody else, but they just want to move that idea quicker. They get a big enough group behind them to push that idea. And now also, even if you're trying to do something that benefits whatever side of the fence you're on, you almost divide your side because you're moving quicker than the whole organization. It would almost be equate it to a military operation. You see let's say a sergeant sees, hey, we need to make a move here. It's not that the move is bad, is that he's moving ahead of his command.
Right. Yeah, you're disrupting the strategy. Well, and I think it gets complicated because the question is, well, what happens when command is compromised, right? And that's the internal conflicts you see in politics, is that people have lost faith in the leadership that exists. And so now it's like the grassroots are like, we're taking over.
Couldn't you almost say, though, go back the last 50, 60 years, 70 years, who was the last politician who inspired respect? I mean, Kennedy was held under this, oh my God, he was the great. And then you give enough time and he was banging hookers. And it's, at the end of the day, they're all just human beings who, I hate to say this, I think a lot of people who strive to political office are striving to feed their ego.
Oh, 100%. They want position.
And the ones that are saying, hey, I want to do good, they get in like you experienced. And all of a sudden, even though I'm playing for this team, I'm not a member of this. They're not accepting me as a member of this team.
Absolutely. Well, I think you can draw that line like very clearly. And that's the difference between like me as a Christian and me as like a American trying to be involved in civics. As Christians, which is what we can go back and go through all of the founding fathers, writings and statements and intentions. God is no respecter of men. They very intentionally and biblically viewed humanity for what it was, right? I mean, you have Franklin, who said that man has two issues, ambition and avarice, the love of money and the love of power. They thought about these things deeply. The founders did, right? You look at the Constitutional Convention and they're literally talking about like what you just said. They're looking at human nature, sin, wrong, our proclivity for selfishness. And they created something called a republic that was based on biblical values and the concept of man's depravity, not goodness. They built a system to control the evil nature that we all tend to side towards sometimes. And that's really important, going back to what I was saying about the culture war, because what keeps me tethered is that I serve God, not man, right? So there's a litmus test in my life that's like, hey, you're getting a little too, your head's getting too big, like humble it down a little bit. Your purpose here is to serve others, right? That whole concept is a biblical concept. It comes from the American Christian Judaic perspective. In fact, right, it was like, we could go on and on with quotes, but, famously, like how the Constitution was not written for, a godly and religious people. It is not suitable for any other. George Washington said, there's no way you can run the republic without the Bible, right? And he's not talking about any book. He's talking about the Christian Judaic Bible. And so, again, you can get into debate and say like, well, I don't believe in this. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in that. But politics-wise, that's our framework. That's where we came from, right? It's the freedom and liberty that everyone enjoys, even the sense of responsibility. Like, why do we believe as Americans that you should work for what you have, right? Because that's what the Bible says. Why do we believe?
That's what my dad said.
Yeah, exactly. Why do we believe that laborers should be duly compensated, or that you should earn what you get? So that it's wrong to just universal income and just give it to people who don't earn it. Well, that's all a concept from the Bible. It says a laborer is worthy of his wages. Even the judicial system is based on Mosaic law and others, but that's the concept of justice and right, is that all of these beliefs in America were based on natural law, right? And natural law was that these things were given to us and endowed by a creator, right? It doesn't work without that. And many times, first of all, this was the case throughout many European countries as well. And so you have these leftist secular movements that have come in and said, let's get rid of it. We don't believe in God anymore. We want to do what we want. And it doesn't work. It leads to these great travesties and these downfalls. And I think you see that today, where you have a conservative party that they really don't believe in anything anymore, but they're still talking about values from like men back in the day that believed in God and believed in right and wrong, but they don't anymore. That's what I encountered. I encountered a group of people who pay a lot of lip service to conservative values, but you ask them, why do you believe that? And they're like, I don't know, because Reagan said so or something. There's no conviction. That's a problem. Because remember, we talked about the psyche of a warrior. Like, if you don't know what you believe or why, you just think that everything's just random and for no reason. It's this quantum like philosophy for life. You're the first people to get wrecked in a conflict, because unfortunately for us, the left is very unified in what they believe. They have a set of ideals. They're based on lies, no doubt. I could debate them all day long, but they believe them firmly. No one's going to tell me that Ocasio-Cortez doesn't believe the world is going to get destroyed every 3 years due to climate change or something, right? It's a ridiculous notion to assert, but she 100% believes that. And so do her voters, and so do her followers. So you notice how the consultants here on the left, their strategy isn't telling the truth. It's just getting people to believe a lie. And if you repeat one over and over again, like Joseph Goebbels said, eventually people will just accept it as truth, especially when there's no counter to it. And that's where I got really frustrated, because I would hear the left lying about law enforcement and crime statistics. And I'd look around the room waiting for people to be like, okay, is somebody going to say that that's absolutely not true? And you have the Republicans, because many of them just don't believe in anything. They just, I'll say whatever you want me to say to get elected. They don't know how to counter accusations. What's worse is sometimes they legitimize them, right? And you're just like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? That's how we get things like AB 109 and Prop 47, and the list goes on and on and on and on. 11% tax on ammo and guns now going into effect July 1st to fight gun violence, right? So we're gonna tax and oppress good, upstanding, law-abiding citizens, and we're gonna let gang members and violent criminals continue doing what they're doing, because obviously that tax doesn't affect them at all. It's absolute insanity. So there has to be a return to the values that made us who we are. That's actually the focus in this first book I wrote, is that each chapter is a culture war topic. And the way I laid it out is I say what the topic is, whether it's life or self-defense or guns or whatever. And I try to paint a historical picture of, this is what Americans really believe. This is what the left or the opposition says, and how it's not worked throughout history. And here's what the Bible says about that issue and how to go forward. And I did that with 10 different topics. It's insane, though, how bad it is when I started, like, I'll go around and I'll talk and we'll sell books or whatever. And I'm encountering people who, in your mind, you'd think, you should know this. Like, you are leading people, right, on like even all these culture war issues that we talk about in politics, and they're just like no concept of why it even matters, like no idea. And I'm like, you understand that like you may be able to say that a part of a belief has something to do with my Christian beliefs, but you understand that there are actual real world applications on why that matters for America, right? Like the concept of the Second Amendment is deeply rooted in Christian Judaic values and biblical belief, but we could all agree that goes beyond your religious belief. There are practical reasons on why we believe in an armed citizenry, for holding an irresponsible government accountable. And so that trail, that bridge between the two, the ideals and the application, are what makes America. So when you have politicians supposedly represent us that have no idea, there's like no connection there. They're like, oh yeah, Second Amendment. And you ask them, well, why does that matter? And they're like, I have no idea. Don't know where it came from. Well, see how you're ripe for to be a victim? Because then the left comes in, they're like, see, let me tell you why it matters and what we believe. And then you turn to the Republicans and they're like, I don't know, I don't have any belief. That is what's happening in our culture. It's rotting. Our kids only get anti-American propaganda in schools. They only get that when they go to college. They get it in cartoons. They get it in movies. They get it in corporations. They've all jumped on this DEI, far left Marxist propaganda about how much we should hate ourselves and hate America and all this stuff. It's insane. And my repeated question is, who's speaking truth? Like, where's the opposition? You do have all these pundits on like conservative social media, podcasts and Instagram and things like that. It's not enough. We need our George Washingtons. We need people with those convictions and beliefs to do more than podcasts. We need them to run for Congress. We need them to run for sheriff, city council. Like, bottom line is, if American conservatives don't get involved in civics, we are done. We will not survive this pendulum. It's going to snap. That's what I believe.
My only thing I would say to that is, I believe it starts a lot sooner. I'll go back to how I was raised. My dad was a Democrat, but the title of who he was, what box he voted in, meant nothing in his life. For him, it was take care of your family, go to work hard, and love the country that you're in. And if we could just boil that back and have it start in households, I think the country would be a lot better. And start raising kids and start having parents lead by example of the line in the song says, don't mind anybody's business but your own. Take care of you and yours. Not the isolationist, not the I don't give a shit about, but it's the start inside the door, and start raising children so that when, like I was told, when you step outside that front door, you represent this family's name and your actions have ramifications. Don't worry about what's going to happen outside. Be more worried about what happens when you come back home. Yeah. And all of those little things, call it conservative, call it whatever. It's just that good, honest values that I think would make a change in this country.
I agree. And so let me ask you a question. So where do you think your father got those beliefs from?
I honestly don't know, because he wasn't born here. He was born in Italy. Came here when he was 14 and got deported.
Well, if you know a little bit about Italy, I would say probably, we can go to exactly what premised Italian culture. Right?
He experienced World War II at its height, right? And fascism and all of that in Italy.
But I would say, like, so Italy, Europe, same thing for South America. You go back one or two generations and you're back to exactly what I'm trying to point out, that the church was the predominant influence in culture. So what happened though is that
the church or family.
Well, but where did the family get that concept? So the ideas that you should work hard and be a good father, like those are all biblical ideas. So, and I'm not, the focus isn't the church. I'm talking about the ideals that culture accepted, right? Let's go back way farther. You have like Aztecs, right? And you have there's a cultural influence right there, right? We're cutting people's hearts out and sacrificing to the sun so we can get rain for the crops. And then you have Western civilization, which is basically there's a God and here's a way that we should live. I may be oversimplifying a vast expanse of history, but that's my point, is that coming from Italy or coming from any European country a couple generations ago, those ideals were Western civilization. And Western civilization was premised on biblical values for how you should live your life. That's exactly what you get when you go back to the 1700s. The difference, and we see this in the American founding too, is that we had those values, but we believed that people should have freedom to believe and do whatever they want. So there was this homogenous culture that was like, yeah, we all kind of accept these biblical values, but like the government cannot force you to go to church. You know, this isn't the Pope. We didn't do those things. That's not America. The issue that happened is a couple generations went by and people forget, like, where did we get those ideas in the first place? Where did they come from? What do we have? What convictions do we have to continue passing those beliefs on to our children in the next generation? And so when you have that disconnect, you know who stepped in? The government. See, you mentioned, right, like, absolutely, right? The Democrats a generation ago, completely different, right? Just like after the Trump conviction in New York, in 24 hours, you got a 33% jump in first-time donors. That means never gave money to him before. Many of those obviously were Democrats, right? So that's just a title. But to the core of what you're saying, the farther away we got from where those beliefs came from, the more the left was able to use the government, and they're now teaching kids, this is what a dad is, this is what a parent is, right? It's not, like you said, it's not in the home anymore. And unfortunately, not everyone has the fortitude that you are describing, because a lot of parents just check out. Most of your child's life will be spent, socially speaking, at school, right? Once they start going to school, that's where they're going to spend most of their time. And you have to understand that in today's day and age, public schools specifically are straight up indoctrination camps. The government, right? Because remember, follow the chain, they're all bureaucrats. Department of Education, like everybody deciding the curriculum, the NEA, the teachers union is one of the most evil organizations in the world right now. Those organizations are deciding what your kids are going to believe. And unfortunately, they spend more time with them than they do with their parents. So yes, we have good parents that try to counteract that, but they're getting hammered every day at school. A man and a woman, no such thing. You can do whatever you want. Core family doesn't matter. Young girls should not aspire to be mothers and raise strong boys and girls. They should just go off and do whatever they want. And, I'm just saying that is the narrative. It's a very counter core family narrative. And there's no opposition. Then they come home from school and they get the exact same thing on Netflix and Disney Plus and on YouTube and on Instagram. These companies that they hear a dissenting voice and they're like, canceled, right? Shadow banned. We're limiting your engagement on social media because we don't like what you're saying. I guess my point is, so far, a lot of conservatives have not awoken to the depth of this war that America's enemies are waging. It's so much bigger and deeper than people realize through big tech control and through the narrative coming from schools, that your generation will be the end of it, because unless you've empowered the next generation to believe, like, what's your strong conviction? Why should I believe these things? What tools or ammo will they have to fight against the left when the government says, hey, why shouldn't you just let people do whatever they want, right? You do you and I'll do me. Well, yeah, there's real reasons why that doesn't work. History's shown us, because when you say screw off to society and you're selfish, like, who's going to be the next generation of surgeons or cops or operators? The concept of self-sacrifice, the whole chapter in the book, that whole concept comes from a biblical perspective that has been passed down through hundreds of years, and we've just totally forgotten it now. Honestly, this is exactly why you'll find very strong, beer drinking, American flag hat wearing conservatives that are like, rah, rah, Second Amendment, pro-life, all these political issues. And then I'll sit down and be like, dude, like, do you know why you believe this? Absolutely no idea. No concept. Well, somebody told me one time. Okay, that's fine, because maybe your dad still carried that banner with him. But how long is that going to last? Look at your Gen Zers in culture right now. I mean, the social media is replete with these style interviews, but I'm sure you've seen them, where an interviewer goes out on the street and just starts asking questions to people. I mean, my gosh, right? Absolutely zero concept of even the most elementary things, like, how does a country work? What is civics? Why do things like geopolitics even matter? No idea. You try going deeper as to, like, why should we preserve the concept of a core family? Why is a mother and father's influence on children really important for building the next generation? Because the left's saying the exact opposite, right? They're saying it doesn't matter. So we actually have a declining birth rate now in America, right? And why does that matter? It's because that's the premise for an entire country. Strong moms and dads build strong families, and those strong families grow up to be congressmen and soldiers and sailors and doctors and nurses. You start to disintegrate that really throughout history. We talked about the Romans, same issue. When the core family is attacked and it begins to disintegrate, society falls. The left's response to that is just not sufficient. It never has been. It was horrible in the Soviet Union. They spent a lot of effort separating kids from parents. The Khmer Rouge did it in Cambodia too. They took tens of thousands of kids away from their parents and sent them to indoctrination camps. Hitler Youth in Germany, same thing. The idea was, we know better than the parent, right? It's Hillary Clinton's "it takes a village to raise a child." And they know that. And all I want to challenge conservatives is, if your enemy is saying that, if they're honing in on that target, right, stop for a second and think, why are they doing that? I just went through this huge debate with the Republican Party last year. I was on the platform committee, and they wanted to change the definition of marriage and change their stance on abortion and pro-life. They were, in my opinion, capitulating to the left because they think they need to compromise to win elections in California. I say the exact opposite. Stop compromising. You'll actually get people to show up and vote for you. And in that fight, I was hard pressed to find people that could even defend why we believed in those things. It was amazing. And so I spent a lot of time, obviously, I put out materials, we attended the convention, and we basically fought for, look, like, you may think that, marriage between a man and a woman is just a religious belief. I go, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Like, it is the core of everything that makes a country a first world country. And I can, by evidence, show throughout history, all these other nations around the world, when they abandoned those subjects, it was the beginning of the end. So does that take away from individual freedom? Of course not. But society can only tolerate a certain amount of individuals who pursue self-interest above everything else, right? Like, let's look at it like, make it microscopic. Let's say you had 100 people in a small town, right? And this was like Survivor Island, and the human race depends on these people to grow. So how many out of that 100 could you tolerate saying, we don't want to have kids? Or I just want to live however I want. I don't care about you guys. Or I'm not going to help collect food. Like, you see how that wouldn't last very long? Like, somebody has to do it. Now, can we give freedom to certain people to do it? Of course you can. You can have the freedom to do it. But then collectively as a whole, you'd have to say, okay, but then we're just going to die. Like, how many out of that 100 could say, I don't want to contribute to society at all. I don't want to have kids, or I don't want to put into, let's say you have a threat, there's an enemy coming to wipe you all out. Well, somebody's got to fight. Right? What about human nature? You have crime committed in that 100 people. Who's going to hold them accountable, and how? You see, there are all these roles for a healthy society. They all, like you said, it starts in the home, right? It's super important. And if you have no homogenous belief on how that should live, you're literally a house divided, right? Like Lincoln said, a house divided cannot stand. The Bible said that first. Lincoln's quoting the Bible when God said, a house divided will not stand. It's an ancient concept that unless you're together on what you believe about your society, you're going to fail. And I think the enemy knows that. That's why they seek to divide and confuse. I don't know if you saw it, but just last week, Medvedev, right? The Russian former prime minister? I'm messing up his title. Hardline, pro-Russia, obviously guy. He issued this sort of not so discreet threat against America that this coming election, they are going to just flood American social media with lies. He said, we are going to confuse you so much that you don't know truth from a lie. And I'm like, oh, you guys, for those of us in the know, in the game, playing in the shadows, that's been happening for a long time. China's been doing that. Russia's been doing that. IRGC's been doing that. North Korea's been doing that. Like, it's just now bubbling to the top. And Americans are like, oh, man, I thought I could just kind of live in peace, and live however I want. And it turns out that these issues affect everybody. Yeah.
I don't want to say this to come off sarcastic or joking, but I honestly believe that one of the biggest problems we're having today is our kids don't play outside.
Yeah.
And I know that may sound like an overgeneralized bubble, But I'm talking about back when I was a kid where you bailed out of the house right after breakfast, and man, you were eating your breakfast as quick as you could because your friends were already knocking on the door, riding their bikes by, and you were gone. Your parents didn't know what you were doing, who you were hanging out with, but what you learned was it's not about... I couldn't have told you any political stance of any of my friends. I just knew that I had my buddies and we played. And if there was, I had a Vietnamese friend, I had a Mexican friend. It didn't matter what the skin tone you were just all friends. And guess what? Every once in a while, you said something that pissed somebody off and you got into a fight. And then the next day you were back buddies again. And our parents weren't up our asses as far as how we were doing things. And there was no participation trophy. If you weren't good enough, you didn't get to do it. And I really think there's some of that, and I'll blame my generation. I think Gen X is the biggest culprit of it. We've taken this sense of we don't want our kids to be hurt by anything. And we've put this bubble wrap around them, and they don't get to just grow up and develop who they want to be as kids. Yeah.
Well, I think that obviously that makes you a racist, right? Like,
I'm sure in somebody's eyes.
But like, all joking aside, like literally, I would ask, to stop and think for a second and ask yourself, because I agree with you 100%. And so the next question is, why did that go away? Where did that come from? Right? Well, you turn on your TV, you look at your kids' shows, you look at the concept of like participation trophies and this whole victimhood mentality, right? It sort of did away with that independent lifestyle that you're explaining. I was just talking the other day, literally, about I would go play with my friends. I'd be gone all Saturday, like sun up till sundown. We didn't have cell phones or anything. And like half the time I was down in like a gully having dirt clod wars, with throwing dirt rocks at each other. And so we learned how to war, BB gun wars. We used to shoot each other with BB guns. We had a one pump rule, that's like unheard of today. But now that I'm involved in like politics and civics.
But kids didn't stop that. Parents stopped that.
Yeah, right. Well, and so that's what now I'm analyzing, like, okay, where did that come from? What was introduced into society that countered that, right? And you see it's prolific in media. You see it in cartoons. You see it in TV shows that kids watch. And then increasingly, you see it in schools. You see in the way administrations change the way they're dealing with it. You could even say organizationally, you see it in all administrations. You see it in law enforcement too. You see, like, you go all the way up. You know what happens when those kids grow up? They form DEI study groups, right? That's the kind of nonsense that what you're talking about. When they counteracted that, they were raising a new generation. It's all purposeful is what I'm saying. I don't think it was an accident. I think that as ridiculous as it sounds, right? Like, I just read an article the other day. It's an old one, but it said critical thinking is white supremacy, right? Stuff like that is just, that's the product of removal of that independency. I mentioned growing up how I went on trips and I traveled and I did all this stuff. There is a certain amount of risk to it, but there's no reward without risk. That's part of character development. You have to let your kids grow up and experience things. And I get protecting them. And I get that, today is probably a different world than the one that I grew up in as far as danger and other things. It's depending on where you live. But the big picture is what I focus on now is culturally, why did that happen? Where did that come from? Well, don't look any farther than the same people you see on the news today. I mentioned Antonio Gramsci today was an Italian Marxist. He was deeply involved with movements that end up in the United States, or the Fabian Society, for example, which leads to the creation of the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society. These were socialist groups, okay, that in Europe that specifically targeted American culture with a political intent. So the Fabian Society, right, they believed that where Marxism had failed in Russia could succeed in Western civilizations, but you would never be able to do it if you mentioned the word communism. So you had to give it a different name. So first it was the Fabian Society, and the Fabians said, let's get into schools. If we can get into schools, we can change the way that kids play outside, etc. And that led to the SDS, the Students of Democratic Society, which was to push Marxist agenda in school campuses. And what happens to college students when they graduate? They run corporations and they go to lead departments and organizations. Well, you know who famous SDS members? Barack Obama. Hillary Clinton was huge. She mentored under Saul Alinsky. You're literally seeing a very purposeful degradation of this culture. And you articulate it in very practical ways, like what happened to kids? Why aren't they playing outside anymore? I say the same thing when I watch movies. I'm like, what is going on? Like, what happened to the freedom-loving, movies that I used to watch where Americans were the good guys? And the answer is, it's not an accident. We didn't stumble into this like, oh, our kids don't play outside anymore, or like, they don't understand the concept of fighting for first place. And if you don't get first, you lost. Sorry, you don't get a trophy. That's not an accident. Those are very purposeful cultural attacks that you can go find it for yourself. Probably most notably was Cleon Skousen, who wrote a book on the 44 communist goals. It's called The Naked Communist. It's incredible. It's like a prophetic book this guy wrote. He was he worked for the FBI in counterterrorism, worked against communism, and he basically outlined like all these goals that he saw in culture that the communists intended to do. My gosh, if you read that list he made, it is like 2024. It is exactly what they said. We're going to go after the family. We're going to promote the LGBT agenda to make sure that people accept it because of an effect that it had. They don't care about people if they're gay. Not at all. It's all political. They care about the end goal, right? They said they're going to go after art. They had to take away the concept of beauty and replace it for like pragmatic or whatever. I forget the wording he used. They talk about the Second Amendment and all these goals. He wrote it in the 1950s. And if you read, I believe 50s or late 40s, if you read the list, the people at the time were like, you're crazy. That'll never happen in America. There is no way that you would ever get us to hate ourselves and hate our country. And quite literally, everything he said had come true. There's another documentary. I'm trying to think of the name. Oh gosh, I forgot the name. It's a great name. Communist. It's Agenda: The Rise of Communism in America. Have you ever heard of that? That's a good one. You should watch that. This is a politician in the Midwest who, as a young man, was invited to. He talks about it in the beginning of the documentary. He was invited to. He was going to Berkeley, I believe, and someone invited him to the local like communist meeting on campus, and he went just sort of begrudgingly. And he gets there and he talks about how he was surprised that it wasn't just a bunch of young, like purple-haired activists. It was like engineers and doctors, adults, older guys. And they were all sitting around talking about what they were going to do and how the culture war was where the fight was, that they would never come out and say communism, because that was like a bad word in America. But if they could get the kids, they could change the way that people thought and acted and believed, and that they would be able to introduce Marxism into the United States. And of course, in the documentary, then it skips forward, right? He's was elected to something. I think it was Ohio. I'm not sure. And he reminisces and says, I look back to that time in Berkeley, and he's like, I realized that every single thing that they said would happen, they have done. Absolutely, through the culture. And that a lot of those young students in those classrooms are now politicians and leaders of organizations, both in the corporate and the public sector. So I guess my point is, like, you're absolutely right. And I see this stuff all the time. People are always kind of, what about this? And, why has this changed? And I'm trying to point it back to apathy, like you said. Like, we let the enemy come in and change us, basically. I mean, that's the short answer, right? Now, we may not. I don't let my kids do that. I am an advocate for pulling your kids out of public school, because unless they're of an accountable age where they have the wherewithal to counteract that, it's literally like sending your kids to like enemy propaganda. It's straight garbage. I would not have my kid in public school at all. They can fight those battles when they get older, right? But that's exactly what happens. You send your kids to these propaganda schools and they stop playing outside, and they come home and say that, you've offended them. And, I'm going to go tell my school counselor that you're not respecting my pronouns. And then on the opposite side, you think I'm crazy. That's how bad this gets. On the opposite side, you have like AB 107 and you have other bills that the Democrats have passed, like the parental kidnapping bill, which says, well, if a kid comes to school and tells basically anyone in authority, it could be a nurse, a counselor, a teacher, oh yeah, my dad says, let's say your son goes in there, my dad says I can't call myself Stephanie and I want to dress, and put makeup on in the morning. My dad said no. Oh, okay. Well, the state of California now has the right to take custody of your child, and they will come to your house and they will take your child. And it's already happened. It happened to a dad, got divorced. He's in Texas. Mom wanted to remove the genitals of their 9-year-old son. She comes to California and Newsom's government's like, he's ours. Doesn't belong to you anymore. That combined with the healthcare bill that had originally passed in 2012. And just so you know, I know this is a lot of jargon, but I'm pointing out that when you're apathetic, you're not involved in civics, they're using the power of laws and they're changing culture, right? That law, the healthcare law that says you have no right to know anything about your child's medical care after they're 12 years old. Okay, this hit me in the face hard the other day because my daughter just turned 12. We take her into Kaiser, right? And my wife keeps track of all the appointments or where, our kids need to go. It's just a general checkup. And she gets there and they're like, oh, the appointment's been canceled. And she's like, no, it hasn't. I have it in my calendar. I got no notice. And they're like, well, you won't receive notice anymore. We didn't cancel it through you. She's like, what are you talking about? Who did you cancel it through? They said, well, according to California state law, you're not allowed to know about your child's appointments anymore unless they give you permission. My wife was furious, right? Apparently they'd canceled like 2 or 3 appointments. And of course, my daughter has no idea. She doesn't have the Kaiser Health app. And she goes, well, what right do you have or something like that? And they're like, well, your daughter has every right to have confidential appointments. She can ask for birth control. She can ask for like transgender surgery if she wants to cut her breast off. And adults at a hospital will take your daughter and literally cut their breast off if that's what they want, absent your permission, authority. So my thing is like, I don't care what you do. If you're a dude and you dress up in a miniskirt on the weekends and that's what you want to do, it's America. You have the freedom to do that. Crossing that line over into children, it's an act of political war. You're not talking about your freedom anymore. You're talking about, and look behind the curtain, right? What's the agenda there? Why do you need to control kids? Why do you need to mutilate them or indoctrinate them or teach them something absent their parents? What is it that your ideology recognize we need to get those kids away from their parents, right? And it's the same thing because it affects our whole culture. Why don't kids play outside anymore like we used to, or our independence? Or you see how it like there's a tie to almost every issue culturally that you see to a very purposeful agenda, I guess. But I digress.
It's one of those things that I don't know if there'll ever be a 100% right answer, because I could change the scenario of the story. And what if there's a kid who's in a home and mom and dad are teaching them that everybody who doesn't have red hair and green eyes is a bad person and you should go harm them? It's all perspectives on what, as a society, we deem as acceptable teachings and what we deem as unacceptable. And over time, I'll completely deviate off that. There is a push right now towards the use of psychedelics to treat PTSD. There is a significant divide as far as whether or not people believe that psychedelics should be legalized and that they should be used for that. There are some that say, yes, we should. No, we shouldn't. I've had guests on the podcast who are veterans who have done psychedelic therapy, and they believe that they got a distinct benefit from it. Where I'm going with this is society still kind of holds on to the image of the 60s era psychedelics, the idea of drugs as a whole umbrella. And there are a lot of people saying, no, as a veteran, you're not allowed to experiment with psychedelics to treat your PTSD. You've got to go to South America, Mexico, wherever it is. It's all about what's acceptable at that given time. Because 50 years from now, or let's go back the other way. Whenever prohibition was, the government came in and said, you can't drink alcohol anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so what did some people do? Hey, I'm going to go make it in a bathtub. And then one day the government went, you know what? We're tired of this. Let's just make it legal again. And it was okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's at that given time what is considered sociably acceptable.
Well, and I think that's the beauty of the American Republic, constitutional republic, is that these guys sat down and created a document that really did last through the ages because they identified core issues within humanity, like we were saying,
Correct.
right? So skip forward to like every issue like this, like prohibition or psychedelics now. I think I compartmentalize it. Obviously, there's two perspectives, but they're clearly connected. And for me, as a believer, as a Christian, I believe that certain things are wrong. But then we don't stop there. We say, well, why are they wrong? There's always a practical application of it. And so there's a litmus test when you look at things like that and say, well, remember how I was talking about that island concept where it's like, are people free to do as they want? Yes. But what about when it destroys society? So the litmus test is when does your freedom cross over into hurting other people? When do you victimize others? And that's where I take the stance as far as narcotics, because you look at, was it Oregon, which legalized like all hard narcotics?
I believe so. Something like that.
It's not going too well for them. Right. And so they bait
But keeping them illegal is not doing that great either.
Well, they weren't really keeping them illegal in the first place. There was no enforcement, right? Because again, you have leftist bureaucrats running an area that they don't know anything about. They don't know anything about law enforcement, right? So coming from law enforcement, we understand that like narcotics is behind 99% of everything that we did, whether it was a homicide, a murder, not everyone, but gang violence, property crime for sure is all connected to dope and narcotics. So the question is like, where does your freedom, and that's always the big debate, right? It's like freedom for safety. It's that balance. I'd like to think that the framers found a good balance, right? They maintained rule of law in the courts. They also gave us the Second Amendment to keep the government in check. That's inarguably exactly why they did it.
But along that same argument, though, you could say, where does your freedom to drink a beer encroach on my ability to remain safe when you're going to crash into me blowing through an intersection because you're, legally drunk?
Well, and I think you have parameters to balance that. That's exactly why you do have a drinking limit. You have DUI checkpoints, right? There still is punishment for wrongdoing, but okay, it's not an equal comparison because you could sit down and have a beer and go to bed. You're not going to sit down and hit some shrooms and then like drive anywhere. You know what I mean? There's a vast difference. Not only that, but also chemically speaking in your brain. That was essentially the argument presented in Oregon. I briefly I don't know everything about it, but I looked into it a little bit, and they were very heavy on the libertarian, like, let me do what I want. The problem is the proliferation of narcotics led to massive victimization of citizens. And so the government has a responsibility. The real purpose of government is to protect people. Right. It's not to overlord or control them. It's to make sure that they're safe, right, and that the country is managed properly. So, yeah, I know. I if I ever go on Joe Rogan's podcast, not that he knows who I am, but I would have
He listens to this one, so I'm sure he'll be calling you right after this.
So, Joe, if you're listening, I'd like to talk to you about this. I would disagree with him, and on the use of narcotics, but I think my approach would be a very practical one from evidence, like in what I've seen in life, and how maybe there is a setting to treat mental conditions in a controlled environment, but I don't think we should be giving people psychedelics to go home. There's too much risk. I mean, you're of the generation to remember, what's it called? Like SHRMs, right? Mm-hmm. Remember the insanity,
the angel
PCP
dust
and angel dust. And I remember one of my cadre, I think up in LA, was telling us about a case, this dude on SHRMs, which, for anybody listening, that's just, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's the cigarettes, right? They would dip in the PCP and smoke them out. I remember this guy getting in a fight with deputies on the second floor. He jumps out the window, breaks both his legs, and runs away on his kneecaps, like just doesn't even feel it, right? Or even now, me personally dealing with fentanyl and different forms of it, meth and fentanyl, right? I just, there's not a realistic comparison between
you bring up a great
narcotics and alcohol.
In a way there is, because it goes back to what we as a society say alcohol is okay for the most part. But it's funny that you bring up, you made me think about PCP and angel dust, because I can't remember the last time anybody's mentioned PCP or angel dust. There was the period, the late 90s, that a new variation of meth called ice that was jacking people up. And that it's where I'm going with it is, every generation seems to have their drug that they kind of glom onto, and the others kind of fall out of attention. Like, when was the last time you heard anybody mention heroin or anybody shooting up with heroin? Because there's not as many people doing
something better came out. Right? That's fentanyl.
Or it drew other people's attention, you know?
Well, so the question then is, if that is the case, and that seems to be the pattern with human beings, should the government morally support that or not? And that's where I would differ, because seeing the results of that. So there's no way that if you legalize psychedelics, for example, you would get a handful of Joe Rogans and combat vets who could responsibly control themselves, right? That would not be the majority. We've seen that with data. The majority would be abused, right? And we know from working the streets in many violent cases that the result of narcotics use uncontrolled is everything bad in a society. It's death, it's burglaries, it's domestic violence. So I don't know that as the government, it's a responsible position to say, have at it. Because then you have to call in the higher question. It's like, well, what is the purpose of government? Like, well, what are you there for? You know what I mean? And then if you do that with narcotics, then does it apply to everything? See, and I think the problem is, most people of the opinion, especially libertarians and stuff, you're not talking about a group of people who maybe have spent time in prison for dope dealing. You know, you're talking about normal, responsible people who, I think, in many times of which may have experienced a very controlled environment, or they don't really know anything about that world, right? I would say a lot of people going like, I should just be able to do heroin. Like, go on a ride along into Pico or something and find a flop house, and let me show you what happens when there's the proliferation of black tar heroin, or now we're talking fentanyl. For heaven's sakes, you had a 900% increase in fentanyl overdoses just in San Diego County. 900%. It's insane. So it's not, I want to encroach upon some homie who wants to get high on fentanyl. My issue is that I live here and I have a family. So I don't want that legalized, because I don't want to go not be able to walk out of my house, right? I don't want to be able to go to Target without getting robbed or a gun put in my face because you're fiending for dope, right? When you legalize it, it still costs something. You have regulation and taxes and everything else. That's why the legalization of weed hasn't really done anything. Not really. I mean, you have legal weed shops. That's fine, right? You still have the illegal trafficking of narcotics. And what's more, you gave way to an entire industry of organized crime. Just not too long ago, I'm sure you remember Riverside County. You had all these, were they Chinese nationals or Cambodians? Chinese nationals. Yeah, and for heaven's sakes, you know, I got a buddy on the wet team, you know, at state level who's hitting cartel grows all up and down the state. You still have people getting their heads cut off and put in barrels of pozole over the same substance. It's a little different than prohibition.
Neither one of us were alive during Prohibition, but I would be willing to bet that when the government all of a sudden turned and said, hey, alcohol is legal again, there were still a large number of illegal booze manufacturers.
Oh, yeah. Most of your distilleries
who were still doing it,
yeah.
But they were like, man, I don't know about, you know, very apprehensively, like, yeah, sure, we'll start making it legally. It's the same way until you,
yeah.
I think the issue with the legal marijuana is it's still illegal to just deposit monies into most of the financial institutions that come from the sale of narcotics. Until you make it legal enough that RJ Reynolds wants to make a pack of marijuana cigarettes right next to the pack of their Marlboro cigarettes, it's not going to catch on. It's still going to be probably largely cartel-based, trying to give you the guise of operating legally. Yeah. That's just my 2 cents.
No, I see you have a point there, and I don't think that prohibition was the right way to go, for the record. But I guess that is a discussion that has to be figured out, right? I mean, because I think people in favor of like free narcotics and psychedelics they love prohibition as an example because it is an example, right? But I don't think that one equates to the other. I think that life is more complicated. Things are more gray than they are black and white. I think you literally would have to look at each individual thing and say, what does this do? What does this do to a person? I have a moral stance against it because we as believers don't believe in altering your mind with pharmaceuticals or narcotics in that sort of playful way, right? So, which is why I would say, like, if you want to have a treatment in a hospital or a controlled facility with a doctor, we do the same thing now, right? We use fentanyl for surgeries, right? But because I agree, fentanyl has benefits during surgery. It's very powerful. That does not equal that I think everybody should have access to fentanyl, right? Why? Because one of the last things I was doing at county investigations was chasing a dealer because 2 high schoolers overdosed on fentanyl in North County, San Diego, right? Because kids, their brains aren't fully developed. And so he was slinging fentanyl to kids out of high school, and they're going home and dying, And I think that probably forms my opinion as well. Like, I know, not to pick on Joe Rogan, but like if we were to sit down, I'd be like, how many houses have you been to where you have to go and tell their mom, who's like screaming in the other bedroom, that, your 13-year-old is dead with a foam cone coming out of their mouth and blood out of their eyes, and they're on their knees, frozen stiff in front of the kitchen, and the only thing left is a tutor and a lighter, I mean, like, countless death scenes that I've had to walk into and deal with. So I think it does change, my perspective on things, I guess, based on experience. I, of all people, am all about freedom, but I definitely think there's a balance, right? It's like the age-old question is like, well, do you have the freedom to hurt me? I know that's oversimplifying it, but it's a good question. It's like, and if the person says yes, they're crazy because they're just an anarchist. And if they say no, they're somewhat rational. I'd say, okay, well then, does that make you like anti-freedom or liberty? Or is it just, you just have common sense? Like, there's obviously limits, right? It's same concept with the First Amendment. It's like,
that would be like saying, hey, we're going to get rid of speed limit laws. Just go drive as fast as you want, anytime you want.
Or you can't scream fire in a crowded theater. Why?
Yeah. There are certain things, I get it, that, for the overall safety of society. I'm just throwing it out from the example of, I've talked to guests who have dealt with, or not necessarily dealt with, they've used psychedelics as a treatment for their PTSD, and it has been beneficial.
And I think it probably will. I think in a controlled environment,
it's going to come around.
I think that, and you're exactly right. With most in favor opinions or stories about it are personal, and there's great luxury, as you know, in being just sort of your own person, right? There's a whole nother level of responsibility when you are in leadership. And so there really is 2 perspectives, because you could personally tell a story about, I used something that helped my mental condition. It was controlled and I'm okay now. And then when you talk about making it law, it's 2 different worlds. You know what I mean? What did Spider-Man's uncle say? With great power comes great responsibility. It really is the plague of leadership. You have to think like 50,000 foot level versus individual level. And there's 2 different things. That's right. That's why I give the island example of like, well, within 100 people, you could tolerate a certain amount of people saying, just peace out. I don't want to be part of this, right? And we have transients on the street that their contribution to society is just harassing people at the red light, doing drugs all day. And I know they all have stories, and I'm not trying to dehumanize them, but their choices have consequences. Mm-hmm. Do they have the freedom to? There's a whole political argument on like, outdoor Americans and whether that should be legal or not. But the bigger question as a leader is, okay, the guy on the corner is one thing, but would you be able to handle if 50% of Temecula was transient? No, you would disintegrate, right? I kind of generally apply that to a lot of these political issues where you're like, you'll get people that try to corner into, I want to do what I want to do. And that's okay. That's one part of the argument. But now let's say you're in charge of 10,000 people. Does everybody get to do what you do? You know what I mean? It's like, you have to consider those things carefully,
Well, it's like the upsurge of the homeless tent encampments all across the country. Mm-hmm. The people who are saying that we should leave them alone and they're not doing anything, and are all people who don't have a guy in a tent in their front yard. Yeah.
Or squatting in their living room.
At the end of the day, the people who are pro hey, let just people live and be, let them live their lives, don't have a homeless encampment in their front yard. Because if they did, they'd be calling the local police going, hey, there's a group of transients who are camped out in my front yard and I don't want them there.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that is ultimately why I find myself politically aligned with who I do, because I spent too much time in reality, right? It would take a great deal of delusion for me to start voting Democrat. Even if you take my personal beliefs and my morals aside, even that aside, just from a practical or civic example, they're so far away from reality that it would be very difficult for me based on my personal experiences in life, because I can't validate anything they say. Everything the left says about law enforcement was a lie. Everything they say about race issues are lies. Everything they say about American history are lies. What they describe as the human experience is a lie. They lie to children about the reality of their choices, right? You notice there's this huge trend right now in detransitioning. You have all these kids that were taken and mutilated permanently as young kids, like 13, 14 years old. Now they're 20 and they're like, my gosh, I have consequences that I will suffer with for the rest of my life. Pain, drugs, even just like, I don't want to be this anymore. Chloe Cole is a famous young girl who was transitioned at the age of 12 or between 12 and 14. She had a double mastectomy. Right? They forever changed her body. And she now is one of the loudest voices on the conservative side against the sort of trans hysteria, because she basically says that she was a tween and a bunch of adults in her life who she trusted convinced her that she should cut her breasts off. And as she got older, she realized there was a phase and she was struggling with mental health and depression. What she needed was help. And now she's forever changed and she's detransitioned, but obviously she'll never have her breast again. She just testified before Congress. Powerful testimony. She's 16 years old now, maybe 17. And it gives me goosebumps every time I hear her. You should, if you get a chance, look up what she testified. It is so powerful.
Can I go back to and I know I'll offend somebody by saying it this way, but just common sense. I think about some of the stupid things that I wanted to do as a kid.
Sure.
And the answer that I got was, when you're 18 and you're an adult and you can make your own decisions, go do whatever you want to do. Why is that so wrong for parents to say now? Hey, when you're 18, do what you want. You want to tattoo your entire body? You want to pierce your entire body? Have at it.
It's very wrong. Apparently, it's worthy of a felony now. If you ask politicians in California, seriously, that goes back to you're right, and I think the enemies know that too, which is exactly why they passed the law that says at 12 years old, your kid is ours. It was never about healthcare. It was about total control over the child. If you notice now that law about medical information, where your child is just straight up separate from you, the government can know. Those are adults too. The doctors and politicians and school counselors, they can talk to your child all they want. Not you, though, right? You stop your child from wanting to.
Politicians would fall into that.
Well, I mean, politicians are the one passing the laws, so there's some political goal in that happening, is what I'm saying. So they're allowed to have input. If you look at the assembly floor in Sacramento, you're gonna hear a bunch of politicians pontificating about how your children belong to them and that you have no right to tell them what to do, etc. And given the whole Chloe Cole example and how much she suffers, right? You have to ask yourself, like, what the heck is going on here? But the truth is, it was never about medical information. It's about what you see today now. It's trickled all the way down into schools, right? So I was very closely following the local, Temecula Valley Unified School District board fight. We backed, all of the conservatives when they ran the first time. I'm talking Dr. Komronsky, who was the board president, Jen Wiersma, who was a board member. And then recently there was a recall. You had all these crazy Marxist left-wing activist groups that lost their mind, all because they passed a parental notification policy. And think about how they were foaming at the mouth, angry. I went to a school board meeting, okay, and I actually put what I set up on socials, and you would not believe the activists that were there. Straight up like Antifa. There was a transgender dude from a sex ranch that's in Temecula at a freaking school board meeting. You're like, what the heck is going on? Like,
we've got a sex ranch in town?
Yeah, a transgender sex ranch.
Oh.
I didn't know it existed until this guy showed up and started talking about it. And he was, dressed like in a miniskirt and all this stuff. And he gets up and he starts talking about how kids have the right. And I'm just going, oh my gosh, dude, these are children's parents. Like, what are you doing here? You know what I mean? Like, I don't want my kids around that environment. And mostly because what my point I'm trying to prove is it's all political. And as a responsible adult and a parent, you have to stop and say, why are they doing this? What's the end goal, right? Do you think for a second that Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton cares about transgender 12-year-olds in Utah? No, they do not. They want to win elections. And that's blatantly obvious.
Let's be honest, though. Trump doesn't care about 12-year-old transgender.
No.
None of them really.
No.
And this, I'm sure this will piss off a lot of people. I honestly don't believe that the majority of the politicians give two shits about anything that they're standing on a platform. They stand on a platform to get votes. That's my take. But I mean,
well, and I think that it's you're right, which is what that's what I encountered, but it's very individual based. So it's not everybody. It's not everybody either way. So
correct.
As you get into it, it's very difficult to navigate because you have to figure out like who's on the up and up here. Like where are the real believers, and then even within that in politics, you have a lot of diversity. So you'll have people who you're like, oh yeah, this guy's on my side, but then he may disagree with you on a particular issue, and then you have extremists within parties that'll be like, oh, that guy's a traitor, he's not with us, and I'm like, no, it's that he doesn't agree with you on this point, but he's with you on all of these points, because politicians are human beings. They're just people, right, that decided to run. So you have some that are absolutely rotten, 100%, right? And all they care about is money. And you have people that get into it and make a difference, but we don't all share the same values. So like they'll vote along these lines, but then they're like, well, I don't agree with you on this part. It makes it very confusing. And what doesn't help is a lot of times from the grassroots, it's like all or nothing. There's no grace at all. It's like,
isn't that almost though what verifies that it's just a business? Because if somebody could just get up and stand in front of a group of people and not have to wear a title of Democrat or Republican and say, I stand for this, I don't stand for this, and just vote for me or not, what doesn't allow that to happen is because of all the money that has to go on in the background by being able to control this person. All right, we pick you as our representative, and we're going to put all our money behind you.
Well, I'll give you an example, a real life example. So you have in California, it's a super majority leftist, right, powerhouse. Newsom does whatever he wants. So does the assembly. They do whatever they want, and they completely, absolutely do not care about the will of the people in this state. There's a couple Republicans up there, right? A few, and most of them basically play ball or shut up. And I know a particular person, actually, I'm not going to say who it is, but there's a particular person who's up there at state assembly who's really kicked against the current up there. And he's gotten just as much pushback and trouble from his own party as he has the other party, because all they care about is money. They want to get funded. So, they literally decide as far as what issues they talk about, not whether it's right or wrong. That would be conviction, right? They decide how it's going to affect their pockets. And that is infuriating to me. When I ran, I completely disregarded any advice as to what I should talk about. I know what I believe. There's right and there's wrong, and that's what I ran on. And nobody controlled what I said in any way, shape, or form. Otherwise, that to me would be the ultimate like coward. Like, dude, like, get off the stage. You don't deserve to represent anybody. And the whole point of running is like, you run, you speak your mind, you tell people this is what I believe, and if they like it, they vote for you. And they give you permission. Hey, go speak for us in the government. That's the whole concept, right? So the idea of saying one thing and then not doing it is an utter betrayal of the American people, because it's like, you're not representing anyone, right? But to finish this story, this person I know has really struggled, because I think they have stuck to their guns on certain issues. And it's been brutal. I mean, they've been removed from positions. They've literally changed their location on the floor to like a side, like almost in the hallway. Anybody who knows would know who I'm talking about, but it's just brutal. We're very nearly approaching the time where we're going to dismantle the whole machine and build something else, because, and I mean, as far as parties, right?
That would be, I think, honestly, the same way organized religion is seeing a significant decrease in the number of new members, I believe the political system are seeing the same thing. You're getting less and less young people that want to get involved in the garbage that is the party system. If you could eliminate it, I think you would get a massive influx of people who were concerned about their communities, concerned about their countries, and would actually get out and vote.
I know, I agree. And I think the challenge with that, what I discovered is like, how do you reach those people? And that's what I'm doing now with our nonprofit is I realize that. So when you're running for office, you have to raise money to reach people. Hence this sort of obsession with money, right? The problem is,
because it's a marketing campaign. It's not a political campaign.
It's all about name ID. Remember, money is not the problem. It's the love of money is the root of all evil, right? That's what the Bible says. It's not money itself. Money is a tool. You need it, right? The problem that I described earlier with this infatuation with money is that they're not using it to win. They're using it to line their pockets. And that's the problem. There is a documentary coming out soon. I don't want to speak on it because I don't think it's gone public, but it's a very up there consultant that everybody will know, who is working on a documentary that's going to expose the consultant class in politics. And it's horrifying how basically the Republican consultant class, by and large, is motivated really by losing elections. Now, they wouldn't come out and say that necessarily, but let me just put it this way. If you are, say, the go-to consultant to run a campaign in a particular area, a county, okay, and you got that great house list, you got all the donors, you know all the people that are going to cut big checks. If your candidate wins, you're done. You are, at least until they have to run again, right? But incumbents usually have an easier time than challengers. So best case scenario for you, where you're going to make the most money, is if your guy loses by one vote. Because you're going to be like, all right, let's recap. Let's come back in a couple years and we'll do it again, right? You have the list. You keep hitting the same people. You're getting percentages. You're getting bonuses. So usually consultants will get a flat fee and then they'll get a percentage jump at the end. And you just keep it going. You keep it going and going and going.
Wouldn't the best outcome be the person that, I don't want to say you backed, but that you were the consultant for, they won, got elected? Isn't that the best marketing tool for the next guy that wants to come in and run?
Not unless you're willing to pick up and move to like Montana, because who are you going to run? So if you want big money, you're going to target congressional races and Senate races. They're in the millions of dollars, right? That's the game. You can run little elections all the time, but you think about an area that's dominated by one particular political party. There's not a lot of work for you to do. How many consultants can go around and do it, right? So what you want is a bunch of people that don't win, because you have work consistently. So
what if we put term limits on every elected official?
Well, no, I'm for term limits, absolutely. And you kind of have
about the poor consultant, man. I don't want him to be out of work.
Yeah. Well, oddly enough, what this documentary I was talking about, they're going to show you the other side, and that's that Democrat consultants are motivated by winning. Their structure is really, they don't get paid unless they win. And so again, that goes back to what I was saying about true believers and how the left is truly wrong, but they're convicted and they believe they're, in those wrongs 100%. And it changes the way that they do business, right? Republicans are like, we're the freedom loving party, so it's like, I don't want to force too much. There's not a lot of control. We're poorly organized. And the consultant class is just utterly destroying. And it's not everywhere. Because you see different cases around the country, but in California, certainly. I mean, ask yourself, what in the world has the Republican Party done in California over the last 30 years? And I will definitely anger people by saying this right now, but it's like I'm getting really sick of it. I mean, I'm involved at a bunch of levels, right? At the local level and at the state party level, and then I ran that one time. It is unbelievable how they're just using the same people over and over and over again to take money and give money, and there's not a lot of action. And then the ultimate issue I have is when they start turning against our core values and what I believe. I mean, you have to understand, like, let's just call it what it is, okay? A huge part of the base of conservatives are Christians. Churches represent the majority of the conservative base in the Republican Party. So when you have a party that literally will slap that group in the face and acquiesce the left on issues like marriage and abortion and stuff because they think they're going to win, you're you're disenfranchising your base, right? It's driving them away. The party doesn't understand this. That's why the rise of Trump was so strong when it happened, because their own party hates them and they refuse to acknowledge that because they're just making money. And then along comes a dissident like Trump, and he's not from the inside party. He's a business guy. He's outside the circle. He's not perfect by any means, but we're not about the person. We're about what the person stands for, right? That's the issue with Trump. He comes in and he's wildly popular. He starts raising, bazillions of dollars, mostly small donations from people that support him. And it just all of a sudden just hits the party in the face. And believe me, they tried quite a bit to stop him and it didn't work, right? I think you're going to see this. Well, you already have to some degree. You're going to see this more at every level. You're going to see people acting like that who are kind of coming in going, forget you. I'm not playing by your rules. I'm going to do my own thing. But in order for that to work, people have to vote.
So that's where I was actually going to ask you a couple minutes back. We've painted this less than rosy picture of running for elected office, especially at the higher levels. You've already mentioned that your plan is to try to run again, or your plan is to run again. But your experience the first time was, holy shit, I saw behind the curtain and there's a lot of games that have to be played. For that to work, do you see, and this goes back to your comment that the party system may get a huge shakeup and may even go away. Who knows when it's going to happen, but it's probably on the horizon. Do you think what's driving it is more of the degrees of difference within the Democratic side or the degrees of difference within the Republican side? Or do you think it's equal between the two sides in their levels of, like you said, some Republicans are very non-conservative where some Democrats are very conservative? Or does everything just end up being independent?
Well, no, I think it's both. I think you have major internal conflicts on the left and the right. And I think that they're driven for different reasons. The left is panicking, like I mentioned before, because they're being driven by extremists right now. And the old school Democrats have lost control of that. Like Nancy Pelosi does not like Ocasio-Cortez. She may not come out and say that on CNN, but that's just the reality of the situation. They've lost it to these like radical left-wing pro-Hamas terrorists, right? That has sort of come to define the left, and their actions prove that. On the right, the frustration is people hate fake people. We hate fake leaders that they say they stand up and represent your values and they do the exact opposite. It's extremely frustrating. And especially living in a blue state like California, where it's like you're incompetent. Nothing you do works, but you demand that everyone follow your playbook still, right? If we were in professional sports, we would have fired this coach a long time ago because they're utter failures. They refuse to deviate that. So you have two different worlds, really. And very different motivators. When the left loses, they riot, they murder, they burn, literally. I mean, I lived through that in uniform, like during those years of, after Trump won.
That's also some major sports fans teams.
Yeah, like in Europe or what. Yeah, but like it was on a unprecedented level watching the left burn half this country to the ground. I mean, the hundreds of millions of dollars in damage, people murdered, cops shot in the head eating lunch, all because of political rhetoric, right? And on the right, the right loses, and it's like, they're like, maybe we should be more like the Democrats. I mean, that's literally what the Republicans, they're just weak, they're cowards, and people are sick of that. And because we are mostly a party of blue collar, law abiding, tax paying people, we don't take to the streets and burn local businesses down and murder people. So what they do, their way of dissent, is they don't show up to vote. And that's a huge problem. In the district that I ran in during the primary, I think it was like less than 3% of the voter demographic showed up to even vote, right? So you had like 1 million people that just didn't even show up, checked out, didn't care. So that's a whole nother issue you can talk about, is the fact that like the people actually deciding what happens is a very small group. Now those numbers go way up when it comes to like presidential elections and things like that. But what people who, they're not plugged into civics, they don't understand how important like congressional seats are and state assemblies and stuff like that. And they just don't pay attention. The left, on the other hand, they're all activists. They're community organizers. They're out there getting it done. They're parading and protesting. They show up. They show up to vote. And so what you have is an illegitimate representation of the people, Because it's not that the Democrats represent even half the people in California. I don't believe that. It's that half the people in California stay home. They don't show up to vote. They don't exercise their God-given right in this country to vote for your leaders. And so to them, I'd say, you have nothing to complain about. You're not doing anything. You're not involved. Like, show up to your school board meeting. Like, these are powerful organizations that are deciding things about your children that trickle down eventually, and they lead to things like you were saying about why your kids don't play outside. All of that traces back to who's leading the culture and the country. And it's like, if your stance is I'm checked out, like I'm not involved in like voting or even local politics, well, then you have nothing to say. Then you've relinquished that right. You refuse to participate. And in blue states, that does more damage than good, because when you don't participate, the left does. They love that all day. They'll play right into that. Oh yeah, those Republicans are terrible. Don't show up to vote. I'll give you a perfect example. The last time my wife and I went to vote, we've been registered Republicans for a long time, right? We go in, my name's on the list. Okay, I can vote. And the one of the ballot workers or poll watchers, whatever she was, she tells my wife, "Oh, you can't vote for a Republican." And my wife was like, "What are you talking about?" And she's like, "Well, you're not a registered Republican." And she's like, "Well, yeah, I am. We've been for years. We've been at the same address, the same house for years." And she's like, "I'm sorry, but if you're not a registered Republican, you can't vote for a Republican in this state." And that is, by the way, the rule as determined by the Republicans. They made that rule, which is a whole other story. And so, but here's where she basically lied. She goes, "Well, my wife's like, well, what do I need to do? Like, I'm going to vote." And the lady was like, "Oh, you could just, next time make sure your registration is good." She was going to send her home. And who knows how many people she lied to and said that to, right? There was a guy standing nearby. Remember, these poll watchers aren't allowed to be like political, but obviously you could tell what party they're from. This guy walks up and he's like, "Ma'am, I can help you." And he's like, "All you do is fill out this little paper right here and register, and you can vote right now." And so I stepped in and was like, "What's up with this?" Like, they don't know like who I am or if I'm involved in politics. And the guy's like, "All day we've had members of a certain party," he wouldn't say Republican because of their rules, "that have been coming in, and the system is saying they're not registered and they can't vote," right? Now, here's the backstory on why that matters. So for one, if anyone ever tells you that, you can fix it right then and you can vote. You should check your registration and make sure, but we checked within 24 hours. The day before, we were both registered. So something in the system changed my wife's registration. 3, that rule was in fact established by the Republican Party. Their rules say if you're not registered Republican, you can't vote for us. The Democrats absolutely love that. We are such fools for having that rule. The Democrats, on the other hand, you can vote for anybody you want. You don't have to be a registered Democrat. You can vote for an independent. You can vote for a libertarian. You can vote for a Democrat. Okay. So if you think about this from a investigative perspective, okay, where there's smoke, there's fire. I sat back and I go, okay, hold on a minute. So if the Democrats in California know that you have to be registered in order to vote, they don't have to because of their own party rules on the Republican side. They don't have to specifically target some kind of cyber attack against Republicans. They don't have to. They can blast it out to everyone. Why? Because on voting day, the Democrats can come in and vote for whoever they want, and it doesn't affect them. But on the by chance that your system glitch hits Republicans, it will cancel their vote if they're not astute enough to realize that they can re-register right there, which you can. But as you know, a lot of people don't know anything about politics. And how many people would be turned away that day thinking like, oh, I guess I can't? It's a chance they're willing to take. I am 100% convinced, right? I'm not paid to investigate anymore, but I did a lot of investigating throughout my career. If someone funded me to find that out, I guarantee I would find that that's purposeful. There is no way that you're telling me every time an election comes up in California that some glitch takes people out of the system that inadvertently, it's like just rolling the dice, right? Or casting a large net. You're going to catch some fish. They are purposefully taking votes away from people. I believe that, no doubt, especially with the fact that the poll worker tried to tell my wife to leave. There's only two things. You're either ignorant and you shouldn't be there, or you lied, right? And fortunately, that guy was near her because I was voting. I wasn't standing with her at the time. That guy walked over and intervened and said, hey, no, you can vote, right?
Isn't that then just a better argument for getting rid of the political parties? You shouldn't have to register as a one or the other. when it's time to vote, here's your ballot. Here's everybody that's running. Pick one.
Yeah, I mean, it's common sense, right?
Regardless of what party you feel you align with, here's the list of people that are available.
Yeah, I talked to somebody about it, and they gave a defense for it. But the defense for that method is it's old, it's outdated. A lot of the rules and regulations that we have were built for a country that doesn't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. They were built for a culture and country that loved their country. They went to Sunday school on Sundays and, like I said, ate apple pie and played baseball. That world is gone. And they're relying culturally on a lot of like givens that don't exist anymore. They used to count on like all upstanding, American patriots registering Republican and paying their dues and voting for our guy. That's just not how it works anymore. No one trusts them. The age of communication and the internet has blown the lid off of a lot of their secretive type shadow nonsense. And people have access to more information now than they ever have before. And like I was saying, as far as voter get out the vote issues is major. I mean, that's a major issue. Even here in the state of California, get out the vote is like their primary thing, which is just them saying like, how do we get people to vote, right? So yeah, it needs to be changed. It needs to be changed, but I'll tell you why. Just my opinion. I don't have any proof or evidence, but just in thinking through it, I would assume that there's kickback on not changing it, because if you change it, what incentive do you have to pay party dues and be a member of the Republican Party, right? So money, again, it goes back to money. And I can't stand these self-righteous people that'll come out and defend it and be like, you need to do it. I'm like, you are part of the problem.
I guarantee you, if you tried to get rid of it, you're going to have the most powerful Democrat and most powerful Republican joined together that'll almost become one person.
Absolutely.
Fighting against it because of the fact that there's money behind it.
Well, and there already is that fear. There is a fear of the uniparty in places like California and other blue states. And it's made a lot of people angry, So here's to not leave on a negative, but to leave a solution, like get involved. Like, and it does take time. You have to get off the couch and pay attention. You got to do some research and look into who people are when they're running for office, right? At every level. School board, county supervisors, huge, especially if you own or operate a business. Like, you have to care about the community that you live in. That's the American way. It's not to have your personal plan and boogaloo out into the mountains in a cabin. It's you have to care about your people and your own children and your friends and your family. And being involved is how you make a difference. Everybody's like, well, what difference can I make? I'm like, try showing up. Show up to a couple school board meetings and you'll see how you can make a difference just by voting. Because it's hell to run for office. I mean, it is a nightmare. It's hard on the families. It's hard on the candidate, begging people for money and speaking, twice, 2-3 times a day sometimes as you approach the end. The minimum you can do is pay attention to what's going on. Don't have your head in the sand and show up once in a while and vote and care. It makes a huge difference.
I've got 2 questions I'd like to grab you on before we wrap this up. And it's more about the transition piece. You talked about your time with DSS. If you could have, would you have preferred to just gone straight from the Army to that position? And for somebody who's kind of bounced around and made it there, what advice do you have for somebody who is maybe active military right now and is thinking they want to get to DSS? Is that a natural pipeline?
It can be. There's certainly a lot of guys I worked with who like retired more at the retirement age, right? Like I worked with guys who like retired out of the Marines or retired out of the Navies, and then they transferred over into DS. You can't get around having a bachelor's degree. That is by and large all federal positions, especially if you're on the criminal investigation side. If you want to be a special agent, you need a 4-year degree, right? A lot of my movement though was necessitated on lack of opportunity. So like I mentioned, when I didn't have a bachelor's degree, I had to do something. And that is my answer right there in a nut is don't be stagnant. Keep moving, keep developing yourself. Like I don't like when I hear guys will be like, oh, well, I tried to apply to this department and I didn't get hired. And then like, so I went back to work at Walmart. It's like, so you've never done nothing since then? Like keep going or go a different route, There's a lot of different ways that you can navigate yourself into places, different agencies, depending on where you want to go. At the federal level, it's all about that CITP, that 1811 status, right? There's a lot of agencies that hire that have special agents. Maybe it's not the one you want to go to. Fine. Go where they'll hire you and then lateral or move when you have the opportunity to do so. You could say the same for, your California Post, right? So maybe you wanted to go to LA or something and you couldn't get hired. Fine. Go to Stockton or somewhere that really needs people. Get your post, put your time in respectfully. And if you have the opportunity to go where you want, then go. At least you have that golden ticket, So I don't know if that answered your question directly.
No, that does. But just, did you know of Department of State when you were transitioning out? Because I know a lot of guys, what they'll do is they want to stay in the federal system because they've already put time in as their military time.
Right.
But I think most of them know Marshals, FBI,
right.
Border Patrol. You never really hear of people talking in Department of State. Is it not kind of marketed well?
I don't think they really want to. It's kind of they don't need to.
Got it.
There is 2,000 and some change agents, foreign servants, special agents around the world at any given time. I believe those numbers are correct, give or take, I guess, their hiring status. And it is, part of the foreign service. So you work for chief of mission, you're at an embassy if you're overseas. And I described, if you're here in the States, you're either at a field office working criminal investigations, or you're on a full-time protective detail like Secretary of State or Ambassador to the UN, right? It's not easy to get into. It's difficult, obviously, given the nature of like national security and what you have access to and who you work with. If you've ever seen a Tom Clancy movie or book, you'll know like there's two worlds that collide there in that area. I knew about them only because I was serving, with Blackwater at the time. Had I not, actually, let me step back. I knew about them because of the mission that we had when I was active duty, right? Part of our mission was running protective security convoys, and we had the embassy mission. And so I was around a lot of diplomats and foreign service people, and we did like the money run, which is moving big loads of cash from BIOP out to the central bank in Baghdad. And there was 3-letter agencies involved in that. So that was my first exposure. But I was like, the military is like that world. I was out there kind of seeing different agencies and people. Even when I was in Iraq, I saw, Border Patrol was there. Marshals were there doing gun missions. We supported them on some weapon delivery missions a couple times. So I kind of knew about them. I just couldn't get there. You're right, though. Even later, like I'm working these like big, cases at a field office, and I would show up to locals departments for help, and they'd be like, "Who are you?" Like people have no idea who you are. They're like, "Oh, Department of State, like state of California," and I'd be like, "No. I work for Mike Pompeo." It was something that I was uniquely positioned to learn about. So I guess you could say the same thing for locals. Like, there's a lot of stuff you can do internally in a large department that you would never know unless you were there. Like you don't even start thinking about it. Like you're not gonna put in or get on the list for SEB if you're not even hired yet. Right. Somebody's gonna be like, "Chill out, dude. Like get in first." So.
And then my only other question was, we didn't hit on it, but for your advice, somebody who's got the interest to go into politics, especially wanting to start at the highest level like you did. Well, you didn't run for president, but what I'm saying is you didn't start at the grassroots level. Key pieces of advice now that you've been through the process of what you wish you would have known going into it.
You have to raise a lot of money. I mean, honestly, if we're being honest, like that is a huge part of running. And I think you have to consider where you're running, right? So if you're running for Congress, you're going to need a certain amount. That would be the first question to figure out. You need to start at least 2 years out for sure. You need to get support and backing. You need people of notoriety to say, yes, I'm with this guy. So there's a lot of introspection there. I think you need to self-assess and say, like, am I somebody that should be leading people in Congress, right? And I know that's kind of weird because it sounds like arrogant, but like it is a question you have to ask yourself. Like, do people want to have me represent them or follow me? I mean, you're going to find out when you run because they'll vote for you or they won't. But it starts there. Those considerations, I think, are first and foremost. Like, is it something that you're supposed to do? Like, or is this something that you think you can do? Right? Can you raise the money? And then immediately start with who's supporting you, right? Like, who is coming in right off the bat saying we're going to back this guy, right? The other thing is you have to know yourself personally, because running a campaign is all selling yourself. You have to be able to spout off who you are and why you should vote for me in about 30 seconds, if that. You have your elevator speech. Past that, people lose automatically. There's a ton of speaking and public speaking. You have to go and constantly convince people of why your ideas are better. And you have to have a good knowledge base, both in history and what you believe and all this stuff we've been talking about, because you're going to get challenged on it, right? I did a whole bunch of forums where multiple candidates would be there, and we'd go up and talk and answer questions for a live audience. And people want to know, like, are you somebody that can get up on the news or stand up in Congress and fight for me? I think that's really, really important, more than people think, because a lot of times people get real excited because they stare at Instagram all day at politics, and they don't understand the practical burden of running for office, or even considered like, well, what does it mean if I win? That wasn't in the cards for me that time that I ran. Had I won, it would have been life-changing. You have to get a place to stay in DC. You're going to spend half your time in Congress and half your time at your home office representing the people back here. I mean, it's a lot, So I don't mean that to discourage people, but I think that like anything worth having is worth fighting for. And I think that we do need people to run. We need more public servants to run, for sure. But you have to really go into it with your head up, knowing like, hey, this is tough and I'm going to take it on, so.
The public speaking aspect, did you go to any specialized training, or was that something you just kind of naturally have the ability to do?
No, I would be lying to say that there wasn't a natural ability. I mean, I think that has a lot to do with it, right? You kind of know yourself. I was exposed very early on to public speaking. And I mentioned my parents were missionaries. I was always involved with stuff they did, like at a church level. So being up in front, whether it was playing guitar and leading worship or speaking or doing stuff like that, was so very early in my life, I was exposed to like being in front of people. And then, of course, the military comes along and develops leadership. And, I was involved in teaching like combat trauma courses to foreign nationals. So very, very early on in my life, I had this sort of exposure. But I mean, gosh, what could prepare you more than working patrol and working the streets? I mean, constantly mitigating, DVs and domestic violence and disputes, and dealing with drug addicts, and you're everything, right? You're a counselor, you're a peacemaker, you're an enforcer. That was great prep. I mean, by the time that was all done, I mean, I can get up and talk to a room of, potential donors and be like, okay, I will say though, not to beat this horse to death, but you really got to know what you believe, because if you don't have any convictions and you don't really know what you believe, you're going to look like an idiot. I mean, people will see through that in a heartbeat. They're not running. So imagine you're sitting in a room, people are lobbing questions at you. And one, they're going to test and see what you know. Two, they want to know if you're on their side, or that's a lot of the questions. And if you're not, or you differ, you better be able to clearly articulate, because when you're running, if you falter or change your mind, you're a flip-flopper, right? It's like, oh, this guy's an idiot. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So you got to kind of have a strong presence. And that plays big time if you do. I didn't reach the general election, but if you do reach it, you're going up against an opponent who has a completely different worldview that thinks everything you say is wrong. And you depending on where you're running or who it is, but they could be throwing stuff like you're a racist, you don't know what you're talking about, you're evil, you're a fascist. I mean, that's the climate in today's politics is brutal. I mean, just look at your local school board election. It is brutal. The insults and attacks on family and accusations and dirt slinging. I mean, you have opponents that spend Oppo research money and, dig up dirt on you and put out negative ads. This person is a liar. He hates squirrels. And it's just like insane. So it's a lot to consider. I'm all about doing it. I think more men need to man up and get involved, for sure, and women. But like, just know what you're getting into,
When do you see your next projected run?
I have no idea.
Oh, okay.
I have no idea. Shortly after we had the opportunity to potentially run for state assembly, and I was approached about it, we talked, and my wife and I decided that it wasn't really something we were going to do. I didn't like the percentage chance of that seat. And I didn't like the area. It was a little bit different than where I was. So like I said, I'm not opposed to it right now, but all the stuff we've talked about, I've identified so many things that I think is like wrong with the process, that we have really poured ourselves fully into the nonprofit, because with this, I get the opportunity to do the podcast and put stuff on socials and speak. Next week, I'm going to speak at a conference at Pepperdine on conviction versus compromise. And I'm going to be talking to students about this. And I love that because I'm not beholden to anybody. I'm not running a race. I'm not responding to Sacramento. You know, I get to get out and speak for what I believe and build people up and provide them those tools. All that frustration I had with like not seeing people give truth, I'm trying to be that now, right? So when you see something on the media is lying about, I try to be very vocal and say, that's not true. You know, here's what's really happening on the street. Here's what crime is really doing in Southern California. And that's even, you know, the book, Defining Truth. That's the point. We wrote a book to put tools in people's hands to say, hey, maybe I don't follow civics that much, but here's an issue, you know, that people are talking about in politics. Well, what does Defining Truth say about it? And all we're trying to do is give you the American perspective. You know, you can change it all you want because it's a free country, but we want to at least clarify the lies. When the Republicans are confused, they don't know what they believe. The Democrats are lying about everything. And I just want to say, look, if you're an American, this is what America stood for. Take it or leave it, but that's what it is. That's kind of what our aim is there with Defining Truth. So
I appreciate your time. I wish you all the best going forward.
Thank you, and thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you watching. But before you go, if you like the video, please hit that subscribe button. Also, any comments are appreciated. Thank you.